It's my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium in honor of our colleague, Julian Leff. Julian, of course, was a very famous psychiatrist, but we've really been astonished by the number of people who wanted to join this symposium. We've run some symposia in the past, and we've maybe had 150 or 200 people, but so far, nearly 1,000 people have registered as either wanting to listen to the symposium this afternoon, or to see a recording if they can't, if they're busy, to see a recording after that. So this just demonstrates the high regard that Julian Leff was held in, and not just in the UK or Europe, but all over the world, because we have people logging in from all over the world. So I'm not going to say a great deal, but just really two main things. Most psychiatrists don't make any innovations. Even us academics do not develop new innovative treatments. But Julian developed four, amazingly. First of all, he, and many people forget this, he was the first person to demonstrate the value of the prophylactic antipsychotics to prevent relapse in people with psychosis. Though, of course, he said they weren't good for people who were relatively well, and they weren't good for people who didn't respond at all. So he said that it was for this middle group that they would be useful. Then he went on to develop expressed emotion and to develop ways of decreasing this by family therapy, and we'll hear more about this afternoon. Then after that, he went into examining the best ways of deinstitutionalizing and resettling people who'd been in mental hospital for many years into the community. And then just when he retired, and should, as most academics do at that point, start writing histories of psychiatry and writing about philosophy, he developed a new therapy, and Tom Craig will tell us about that. So it's an astonishing number of developments. I had relatively little to do with Julian, even though we were both at the Institute of Psychiatry, because he was in the social psychiatry bit of the Institute, which was very far away, both geographically and emotionally, from the biological bit of the Institute. And a funny thing happened in 1995. We both put in applications to the Medical Research Council. Julian to study the social aspects of psychosis, and I to study the biological aspects. And the MRC, clever people, decided to reject both. And they said they would consider a joint application from the two of us. I was very grumbly about this. I thought this was terrible to have to get involved with Julian and social psychiatry. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because from that stemmed the ESOP study that we'll also hear about today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Joan Raphael Leff, who, as well as being Julian's wife, is a distinguished social psychologist and psychoanalyst. And we know this is not easy for you, Joan, so we're very privileged and grateful that you could come and start the symposium by telling us a few words about Julian from your point of view.
Thank you.
Joan.
We've come together to celebrate Julian's professional legacy. I'll tell you about some qualities that made his work possible. Apart from his original contributions to clinical, social, and academic psychiatry, Julian cultivated hands-on skills in many diverse fields: music, theatre, writing, art. In fact, some called him a Renaissance man. He was engrossed in many fields and retained whatever he observed, heard, or read, and had a phenomenal memory for obscure detail. Multi-talented, Julian gave himself fully to whatever he did. He paid meticulous attention to quality, and before implementation, always put his design to rigorous tests. Our house is full of his creations, books, sculptures, silk screening, and silver jewelry. As Robin said, he was productive even in retirement. He reread Dickens, played chamber music, trained in piano accompaniment, served as an independent chair for 15,000 UK spiritual healers seeking voluntary regulation. He wrote a family biography spanning 7 generations, as well as piloting avatar therapy. Julian left school before his 17th birthday, but young as he was, even as a medical student, he recognized the patient as a singular person. In his own words, the detective work of selecting the precise questions that would distinguish between one cause of the symptoms and another fascinated me. But alongside the intellectual exercise, and always flowing beneath it, was my empathy for the sick person, fearful of the threat to their health, their life, their ability to care for themselves and their family. This attitude was in variance with the prevailing categorization of patients as a case of this or that. He was a remarkable combination of level-headed logic, free imagination, and empathy. Throughout his research career, Julian maintained clinical responsibilities and was considered a magical psychiatrist. Once again, I think this excellence can be attributed to his own special blend of professional acumen, sensitivity, and open-minded tolerance. Actually, I think Julian was the epitome of low EE. Clinical wisdom always tempered by light-hearted humor and compassion. His non-judgmental receptivity enabled patients to trust him and to speak freely. As they confided their feelings, he recognized symptoms as necessary defenses. For instance, he regarded neologisms not as pathological communications, but as word inventions called up to articulate bizarre experience. And Julian responded sympathetically, realizing how disorienting such strange internal happenings could be. He was already preoccupied with this early in his career. He figured that, like the stars that are there but cannot be seen by day because of the sun's brightness, so while we are awake, unconscious processes in the mind are eclipsed by the continuous bombardment of sensations. Applying his unique mix of scientific and lateral thinking, in his MPhil project, he found that under experimental conditions of sensory deprivation, within minutes, even healthy volunteers produced visions which he likened to hallucinations in people with schizophrenia. The way I envisage the source of Julian's originality is that whatever he took in blended with his own archive of knowledge, but it was not a static repository. Well-digested erudition and inventiveness were creatively interwoven to produce novel formations. New personal encounters and transcultural discoveries bubbled away in unison with facts and stories he'd observed and absorbed since his childhood. Mulling over their meaning, Julian distilled ways of fostering change to improve conditions and alleviate human suffering, because he really cared about people. One colleague described him as a man who fought with great commitment and scientific honesty for some of the most vulnerable and marginalized members of our society. Julian's socialist parents were good models. His father contributed to the founding of the NHS, and his mother started a small local peace movement that grew into the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Julian, too, was a social reformer. In a culture of blame, he supported families and worked internationally to reduce the stigma of mental illness. In apartheid South Africa, he delineated socio-political factors underpinning ethnic discrepancies in psychotic relapse. Traveling widely, Julian explored the use of traditional healing. With his large TAPS team, he assessed minutiae of everyday experience of patients in the community and provided evidence for hospital closure. He trained nurse practitioners to deliver family interventions and fostered the professional development of younger colleagues, and even organized lunchtime croquet games to dissipate resentments among workmates. While securing himself, Julian was not overconfident, neither pompous nor overbearing. He lived without subterfuge or intrigues. In fact, with his low, easy laugh, memorable mane of white hair, and expressive face, Julian made close friends all over the world, even at the WHO headquarters, as Norman will remember, where he often played chess with strangers whose languages he did not know. After his death, scores of his students and collaborators wrote to me, remembering Julian, not only as a brilliant teacher or inspirational pioneer or mentor, but as a kind friend with twinkling eyes, a wide smile, and warm, endearing personality. Always fun-loving, positive, and willing to learn, Julian was a modest man who carried his gravitas lightly. Finally, Julian was also a good communicator. Known as the Attenborough of psychiatry, his enthusiasm was infectious, and he was never overawed. He ascribed his talent for lively lectures to dabbling in drama in medical school, when he acted with great relish in UCL's cabaret team called the Fallopians. He spoke without notes and fluently and as directly to an audience as he did around the kitchen table, as you'll see in the break. It's rare that public presentation so coincides with a private man. Julian lived authentically. He embraced life to the full, even in his last illness, which he accepted with grace. Knowing that his work would carry on enabled him to die peacefully. We miss him, and we're very grateful for this opportunity to celebrate him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan, to bringing Julian back alive and showing us aspects that some of us did, or some aspects of Julian that we didn't know, and other aspects which we remember with great pleasure. So I thank you, and we should now go on to our first speaker. First speaker is Professor Tom Craig. Tom is a well-known social psychiatrist, been well-known in the field from his early days working with George Brown, and then, of course, going on to found and then assess the value of the first early intervention unit for psychosis in the UK, the Leo unit, which has been so influential. And then, of course, you can't really believe a therapy, even though it's very persuasively presented, until it's independently replicated. And that's what Tom has done with the Avatar therapy, and with Julian's blessing, took on the idea and the plan to independently replicate Julian's early work. So I'll stop at that and hand you over to Professor Tom Craig. Tom.
Thank you, Robin. Let me just share my slides. Whoops. As ever, sorry, I need to put the sound on. I always forget to do that. Oh, I'm a bit nervous that the sound isn't going to work because my sound button's disappeared. Life is never simple, is it?
No, this is half the fun of these symposia, Tom, in watching the academics struggle. And your co-speakers, with a couple of exceptions, are so old that they won't be able to help you.
Quite so. Oh well, here we go. Let's see what happens. I think I'm okay. We'll see. So it's a very great pleasure to have the honor of talking at this symposium on behalf of Julian. I just had an insight from Joe, and I understand why he was so good at avatar therapy, because of course he had acting skills as well as therapeutic skills. So today I'm going to talk very briefly about Julian's invention of avatar therapy, very briefly about our clinical trial, the one that we ran with Julian to replicate his early results, and then finally just leave you with where we are now with some new developments. And by way of background, stuff everybody here knows, but auditory verbal hallucinations, voices, are extremely common in schizophrenia, up to about 70% of people. They very often persist despite the best of treatments, despite pharmacological or cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis. Both of them having, in many cases, only a very small to a moderate effect. And yet, what we know is that voices are experienced as coming usually from an entity with a personal attribute of one kind or another. And it does seem that people who are very submissive to their voices have histories, if you ask them about submissive behaviors earlier in their lives. And so there's something about the person and the voice that suggests an interactive approach might be useful. And prior to Julian, several relational approaches were developed. So Chadwick at the Institute, Rom and Corstens elsewhere tried three-chair approaches where the idea was the person would project their experience of the voice into the empty chair, and they'd have a discussion with the therapist and role play what the voice might say in response to challenges. And it was Julian's genius that went and looked at this data, looked at people, like youngsters playing on computer games, and thought, hang on, suppose instead of talking to an empty chair, you could actually converse with a face, a representation of your voice, and hear the voice in the way that it normally is experienced. And he met this chap on the left here, Mark Huckvale, who was a professor of speech science at UCL, and with Mark created this amazing software. So he used on the left, the face gen software that police use for identikit manipulations, and software that Mark had developed that produced a series of transformations of the therapist's voice, so that by pushing a switch, Julian could sound like a complete range, everything from a 90-year-old man to a 15-year-old girl, an extraordinary technological first, really, of this voice transformation software. And to give you an example of what that might sound like, here is a little video clip.
You're not.
And I hope it works. Shout it if you don't hear.
No.
You got it. You're not. You know you are. You're a piece of shit.
Now, right.
What's all this about? You know I'm talking the truth.
One of the striking things in the therapist voicing what the voice says is the therapist has not only to be a good actor, but also to use the words and phrases that the person usually hears. And those are almost always nasty, hostile, critical, foul-mouthed expressions, which therapists are very unlikely to have ever used talking to their patients in any other category, any other experience. And so it was, by its very nature, not just a clever invention, but actually a daring one to actually try this, because it could have made things a lot worse. And there were many people, when they first heard Julian talk about it, that wondered if that mightn't be the case. And indeed, I was one of them. I sent referred a patient to Julian for therapy. It didn't work at all well, but the patient said to me, well, it didn't work for me, but it wasn't that bad. And that made me keen to try and see if we could do a replication. So Julian and I together put an application into the Wellcome Trust, and we got money to run the trial and to further develop the therapy and the technology. And The therapy as Julian invented it really hasn't changed across either his pilot or our replication. The therapist and the patient sit entirely in separate rooms. So the person is left, as it were, confronting the avatar voice replication on their own, which is itself quite an anxiety-provoking, challenging experience, but one in which, if the patient is successful and able to defend themselves against the voice, is in itself rewarding and a benefit. And so there's this three-way discussion. The therapist controls or manipulates the discussion. It starts in the first part using it verbatim, while the therapist encourages the person to be assertive, to say, I'm not going to tolerate this nonsense anymore, to stand up, to take control over the experience, and very gradually manipulate the avatar such that it seems to respond to the increasing strength of the patient and broadens the dialogue. It goes into areas of self-esteem. It uses sort of formulation, understandings of what might be behind the sort of psychological aspects that might be behind why this person experiences the voices they do, to broaden the dialogue and have a wider discussion, so that by the end of just 6 sessions, and we're talking very short therapy here, these are 6 one-hour sessions, of which with the avatar, never more than about 15 minutes. And so in that time, shifting both what the avatar says to become more friendly, more accommodating, more understanding of the individual. And then the participant is given a recording of the sessions, and it's suggested, Julian used to talk of it as being, telling the patient, you have me in your pocket, you can listen to me at another time, to use it as sort of a homework exercise. And Julian did that work, set the whole thing up, and ran a small pilot study. He had 24 patients. He did a small initial randomization, and then the people who hadn't got therapy were offered it at the end. So at the end of the day, there were 16 people who had had the therapy. 3 of the 16 completely stopped hearing voices, and the voices remained absent for 3 months. And this was, as Julian said, quite staggering for such a short therapy to have any effect. And people were really quite convinced in talking to him that my voice had gone, it stopped, it's got out of my life. But even the people for whom that wasn't the case had reductions in the frequency, the associated distress, and related depression and anxiety at a 3-month follow-up. So this was really a fascinating outcome from a very small study with what was really a very experimental first step, almost a proof of concept study that piqued my interest, certainly indeed, and several other people, and led us together to develop the next therapy. Now, I don't actually, which is a great shame, we don't have any recordings of Julian doing therapy. So sadly, you're going to have to listen to me doing it. And I should say in this point that Julian, when we got the money, spent a great deal of time not only just training us in the initial approach, but coming to joint supervision sessions, listening to what we were doing, reflecting with us, commenting, and skills building. And I am eternally grateful to him for that input. So here's a typical patient that I saw in the therapy. He's a 52-year-old man. He has had a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia for about 30 years, and he lives in a supported group home. The most striking features of his illness are the voices and impaired activities of daily living, notably his complete fear of going anywhere near shops. And although he's had several voices over the years, these gradually crystallized in his understanding of them as being a reflection of his sociopathic father. To give you an idea of the kinds of things the father did, the father once was in a dentist's chair. The dentist hurt him, he jumped up and he punched and knocked the dentist out and got arrested by the police. So that was the kind of nature of the dad. And he was very abusive and very, very angry man, but would always say to our patient growing up that he only did these things to demonstrate how to be a strong person. And the voice the patient heard used to sound a bit like from his father in latter days, who had died, and who seemed to be coming from somewhere, he thought, in hell or in heaven, and would say words like, you're a wimp, you're a faggot, pull your finger out, whenever he went out of the house, would jeer at him, would say that he was a complete failure and needed people to accompany him wherever he went. So that's a bit of my background. And if you remember, I said that the therapy has these two phases. They actually run one into the other, but it's easy to conceptualize it as a first phase where you're encouraging the person just to stand up to and refuse to give in to what the voice is saying. And in this, you'll hear me do an intervention. I'll just draw your attention to it, where I encourage him not to respond in a particular way. And this is sort of part of one of the therapeutic interventions in this, in addition to just facing up to the voice. So here we go, I hope.
They're a waste of space.
Yeah, I used to be a waste of space until I got grips with you.
You haven't got me, I've got you.
So sometimes you do get to me. Sometimes I cut myself off from people because of this.
How are you going to stop me?
I have no idea. I have no idea. Maybe when I'm dead.
Don't say that. Tell him you're going to stop him by just ignoring him and not taking anything he says to you seriously.
Okay, I'm not taking you seriously. Okay, I'll take that back.
Why should I listen to you?
Why should I listen? Why you should listen to me?
Yeah.
Because I've got a lot to say. I have a lot to say. I'm feeling more confident now. I don't let the voice try to take over my life anymore.
I still think you're a wimp. I think you're just putting on a show.
No show.
You're just putting on a show because that's what that doctor told you to do. You don't really feel like this.
I'm not putting on no show. I'm nervous.
Yeah, you're going to have to prove it to me, wimp. How are you going to prove to me that you're strong?
I was going to press the stress button, but I thought, no. I can deal with this. I can deal with this.
You didn't press the stress button. I thought you pressed the stress button.
No. I can deal with you now. I can deal with you.
Well, it certainly seems that you're strong today. We'll have to see if you keep that up.
That's absolutely brilliant today. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I feel quite good.
Yeah, you should be. It's very strong, very good. So that's all we're going to do today.
So that's a typical session one, where he achieves, in slang terms, a win. He feels he's achieved something over the avatar. And then I'm going to play you a clip out of session 4, which is 2 sessions after this one. I hope I am anyway.
They're a waste of space.
Nope, wrong. I'm not going to play it there. I'm going to try and do it again now. Let's try that.
Say to me today.
I've done my shopping.
Really?
Yeah, I've done my shopping.
And you didn't need me with you?
No. I was determined. I was there at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning. I can't remember now. But I was there early. Yeah.
You didn't get the sweats?
No, I didn't get the sweats, no.
You went right through with it? You didn't go?
Yeah, right to the cashier and paid the money and bagged it all up and just walked out.
I must have got it wrong about you. You're really a strong man now.
Yeah, I always have been, but I can't do nothing when you're rattling around in my head.
I see. I thought I was helping you, but
No, you didn't help.
It worse. I just wanted you to be strong. You are.
Yeah, I'm feeling that way.
You're a lucky man.
Why am I lucky?
Well, people like you.
Well, it's the things you used to do. I mean, you go around beating up someone's son, someone's dad, son's dad, and you wonder why people hated you.
Yeah, but I didn't want people to be walking all over me and the family.
It's the wrong way of going about it. There's no need. The violence you should leave for people who are violent, you know.
Yes, I'm beginning to think I got that wrong. You seem to be stronger than I was. We should have had this talk earlier.
So there's a lot going on in the therapy. So not only is the therapist making the avatar, the voice, become more conciliatory, but beginning to work on changing the nature of the voice itself. So in this case, his father is changing from being abusive, nasty, swearing at him continually, to being supportive and recognizing his strength. And the very last session, he said, I haven't heard my father at all for the last week, but we had the session anyway. And he said, look, Dad, I think you should just clear off to heaven and have a decent life and let me have my life, because it's absolutely wonderful. I haven't heard you last week. And at 3 months and 6 months at the independent follow-up, the voice still wasn't present. And what's even more remarkable, about 18 months later, I was outside the hospital on Landau Road, and this guy came out of a shop across the way with a shopping bag in his hand full of groceries. And he recognized me and came over and said, "Hey, doc, good therapy, good therapy." And I said, "What, have you not had the voices?" And he said, "No, not at all, not since that last day when they went away." So that was an echo of what, and a very nice echo of what Julian had experienced. Other things I could riff on forever, but one of the things Julian was really good at was accents, because that's something the avatar can't do. It can't imitate accents. So I was pretty good with people from Jamaica, because I could put on a Jamaican accent. And Julian was brilliant in putting on accents of people from South London. So there's an acting streak in this that I suppose I was attracted to, and that I think therapists who enjoy this therapy are a bit attracted to as well. So to move on from that, here's the basic therapy we did, the basic control trial. So we thought, well, it could just be that all of this is a sort of an attentional phenomenon. Talking to somebody who's nice and warm and encouraging could even just be purely a Julian effect, I wondered at the time. So we did this comparison where we randomized people to either receive avatar therapy as Julian had delivered it, as we delivered it in the therapy here, or equivalent number of sessions of supportive counseling. Not supportive counseling in the way research often describes it, as sort of playing a board game with people or going out to the cafe for a cup of coffee, but actually doing a therapy, doing a very simple problem-solving therapy, helping people set goals and achieve them over the same number of sessions, 6 to 7 one-hour sessions with a friendly psychologist to help them do that work. And we did that comparison. And the numbers in the little things in red just show you the follow-up rates. We were very pleased with those. So 12 weeks, our primary outcome, we had 80% follow-up, and that was still 70-something% at 6 months. To give you an idea of what we started out, we also, and this is possibly slightly naughty of me, but I thought, let's throw a real challenge at this therapy. Let's not just do people who have just had voices for a few weeks. Let's take people who have a chronic treatment-resistant disorder. So this is what our sample was. They were people who had about 80% had a schizophrenia diagnosis. The durations of their illness was long. These are the mean durations, 19-20 years. They were all on antipsychotic medication. 2/3 were on clozapine, and just over 50% met a sort of formal research diagnosis for treatment-resistant psychosis or schizophrenia. The other thing, of course, is that they often heard multiple voices. I've shown you a chap who really only had one voice, and it is no doubt that having multiple voices is a challenge for the therapy. I'll come on to that in a bit later. What's it like sitting in front of the avatar? Well, two things. One is a sort of a rather techie measure, which is whether or not you feel when you're sitting talking to the avatar that you're actually talking to your voice. Your voice, the voice you usually hear, is in the room with you. It isn't just that you're doing something on a TV screen. And you'll see certainly at the beginning, the scale actually only goes up to 13. So it's a very high level of sense that your voice is really present as you are sitting in the room talking to the avatar. And that dips when the avatar becomes nice. That's an interesting phenomenon that may even represent a slight decrease in the potency of the therapy. But it's retained high throughout. And of course, as people get more and more confident, their levels of subjective anxiety falls. What about the results, though? The main primary outcomes as measured by the independent research team, they sort of blinded, they were blinded to outcome. And what you see is, I'm just showing you just two data here, both on the frequency of voices as measured by an instrument called the CIRATS, or the associated distress. And you see that at 3 months, the avatar therapy produces a significant improvement over the supportive counseling. And that improvement is still there. One of the things that we had a lot of trouble in writing this paper, people all said, but look, avatar therapy stops working by 6 months. No, it doesn't. The improvement was maintained. It is that mysteriously, And I think Robin, tongue-in-cheek, has said perhaps this would be a very good kind of therapy to introduce because it's cheap. Supportive counselling continued to improve. I've got a bit of an insight into that, in that what happened was supportive counselling had more of a lag in its delivery, and so people were still, more people in the supportive counselling arm were still seeing their therapist at the 6 month or at about 5 month follow-up. So it's probably a slight difference in the duration of presence of therapist, I think, is what's going on in the therapy. But anyway, an encouraging, very encouraging result, and a complete replication of what Julian had experienced at 3 months. We also had about 5 people in our trial that stopped hearing voices. I don't know, apart from the one chap, I don't know that it was any better after the 6 months. He was just a chance encounter. I don't know what happened to the other people, unfortunately. And let's just put this up just to make a point, really. It's a very specific therapy. So we get the biggest bang for our buck on the voices. We have very little impact in our study, and in this replication, very little impact on quality of life or depression or anxiety that are associated with the wider, any present delusions and paranoid symptoms that there are present. There is a few clues of interest. So if you look at the CIRAT's delusional items and the Calgary depression, although it crosses the lines, you can't say with any confidence that you're having an effect. There is a small effect, not as good as Julian achieved in his trial, but a small effect that maybe we can build on in future studies. So at this point, what did we have? Well, we discovered, as Julian had, that avatar therapy is not for everyone. About 20% decline the offer when they hear what's involved. They just don't feel they can stand up to their voices. Interestingly, once enrolled, there was more people dropped out of therapy in the supportive counselling arm than in the avatar therapy arm. And in fact, in the avatar therapy arm, there were 8 people, 8 out of the 75 who dropped out. And you'll see 2 people dropped out because it was too frightening. One of those was one of mine, and it was the very first person I tried to treat. And I just didn't understand how to do it. And I was just too horrible to the person at the beginning, and learned that lesson very, very quickly. And that stopped completely when we introduced a video camera feedback, which is a slight wrinkle that additional to what Julian had done, but we could see what the person was experiencing and respond accordingly. Interestingly, no adverse events that we could attribute to the therapy. Of course, there were adverse events. People had hospitalizations, they had relapses, but they weren't related to therapy, with the exception of one person who had an unusual but not an adverse event. He was a man who was terrified of being mugged in public. And he was coming home late at night in Brixton, and he saw a group of men standing around the lamppost. And he thought, oh, here it is. This is the gang. They're going to do me now. And then he said, then I saw in a shop window a reflection of a TV that looked like it was playing my avatar, and I felt reassured. And he walked past them. That's the only evidence we have in admittedly only 75 patients, plus Julian's and some people we've done subsequently. So about 100 people have had therapy up to now. And that's the only leakage outside of the sessions that we've had. I've already mentioned the limitations of multiple voices. We're only doing one voice at a time. How do you know which one to work with? Well, we don't really. We pick the one that's the most dominant, the most scary, but maybe that was the wrong thing to do. I think there's more research to be done to figure out how best. And people who are very severely thought disordered really struggle with this. We did plow on through, but I would say severe cognitive impairment and thought disorder, it makes therapy very, very difficult to deliver. And of course, there are limitations on what the therapist can do. I mentioned accents, but of course also language. Some people, especially in London, there are multiple ethnicities, multiple voices, and we could only speak English apart from one of our co-workers who was Spanish and could do some in Spanish, but otherwise we were very limited. So that's where we are up until 18 months ago. And we published these results. We were all very excited by them. The effect sizes were bigger than anything we'd seen in equivalent psychological therapy trials. And there's been a lot of enthusiasm. So we went back to the Wellcome and said, look, we think this therapy has real promise. It ought to be being delivered as part of routine care. But we need to do more than, I mean, there was, if you like, there was the Julian effect, and now it was still the Julian effect, Julian plus Tom plus the other Tom, 2 therapists worked very closely with Julian. Can we really train other people? Can other people deliver this to the same degree? And so we got some money from the Wellcome again to do a larger clinical trial that is currently ongoing. This is just to show you. So this is what we wanted to do and what we've been doing over the last 18 months. We wanted to explore also the mechanism. Can we get any signals, any clues as to how this works? And there were two aspects of the work that seemed very significant. First, the people who did really, really well experienced rapid reductions in their anxiety in confronting the avatar. So anxiety levels dropping dramatically by the end of session 2. Could it be that that's an important mechanism? Other people didn't respond until the much later phase when we were actually working with the character of the avatar. We were working on a formulation of what the avatar was, what it meant in their life, and doing explorations with the therapy of that aspect. And it could therefore be that characterization is just using that as a kind of a throwaway phrase. It's a complicated idea, but that's something in the characterization, which Julian would say was crucially important. But we didn't necessarily see that in the study. Is it characterization that really matters? Or is it two aspects of therapy for two different sorts of people? Are some people just have much more highly characterized avatars than others? And do they need that work for it to progress than the person who has just a rather vague idea of an abusive voice that swears at them? The other thing we thought we would do, in addition to exploring mechanism, was to see whether our therapy has a real impact in the day-to-day lives of people. So we're using, many of you will be familiar with this event sampling methodology. So for a week before, during, and in the follow-up periods, people will have a mobile phone. It'll ping at odd times during the day. They'll be asked, are you hearing a voice? What, if you so, what is the nature of it? What are you doing at the moment? Are you with people? Are you living? Are you entirely on your own? What's your mood like? So a real kind of real-time measurement of real-time impact of voice hearing, which is a sort of a step beyond the retrospective measure of the SIRATs that we used in the first trial. We are, of course, still using the SIRATs in this trial, and indeed our primary outcome is still changing the SIRATs, but we want to really see what day-to-day experience is like with this therapy. We also need to establish cost effectiveness. We need to know whether this is an affordable and a cost-effective therapy to roll out in the NHS. And to that extent, we're also training a wider cohort of therapists. We want to train 20 clinicians of all different backgrounds in the different sites in the NHS. And hopefully it'll work again and we can bundle it all together and apply for a nice approval. Mark Huckvale has continued working with us and has done a lot of work on the software, making it more robust, much easier to use. It's now got a medical device approval. That was a bit of a challenge. We can deliver the therapy now using Zoom, which is another sort of plus for us. Enormously helpful at this time of COVID where everything is locked down and you can't meet people. And it also automatically collects important data that will be needed for commercialization. So we've got, that's been already achieved. This is the ongoing deal, which is the current trial. So it's a multi-site randomized control trial comparing 3 arms. So we have what we've called the extended, which is the full avatar therapy as delivered by Julian and by us, but now running for 12 sessions rather than just 6. Or a brief therapy, which is the original 6 session of Julian with an emphasis on anxiety management and treatment as usual as a comparator. And then that's running, we're following people up at 16 weeks and 28 weeks. And there are 4 university centres involved in this. So it's us in South London, it's the UCL in North London, it's University of Manchester and Glasgow, and their associated trusts. 2 mental health trusts will receive training in each of those, associated with each of those centres. So it's a heavy deal. And just now in winding up, I hope I haven't overshot my time. I forgot to set a timer, but hopefully not. Here are my acknowledgements to my collaborators. Philippa Garrity is as you all know, is the Professor of Clinical Psychology at King's and is the Chief Investigator. I'm a co-Chief Executive Investigator for KCL, and then UCL is Miriam Fornell-Zambrojo, who interestingly was a research psychologist with me when we did Leo. So some things you do hang on to people in this game, don't you? With Mark Huckvale, Jill Haddock in Manchester, and Andrew Gumley in Glasgow. It's a bit psychologist top heavy at the moment, but we're going to try and change that in the forthcoming training. We just passed 52, I think, people into the trial now, so we have a long way to go. We're looking for 345, so we're only just begun the trial, really. We launched in January, but so far we're on target where we should be at this point, and we just hope it carries on. So it's a thanks to all this enormous army of people, and of course, the most thanks of all goes to Julian. Julian, fantastic to introduce me to Avatar. It's been the most fun therapy I've done, and he certainly inspired me with the fun of doing this stuff. And so just that's it for me, and just thanks to Julian.
So thank you very much indeed, Tom. It certainly sounds a lot more fun than prescribing haloperidol.
Absolutely.
So I should have, poor chairmanship, I should have said to people that they can put their questions in the chat or the Q&A. And Martha, you were going to read out any interesting questions?
Yes, we have, Tom, two questions that relate to the choice you made with Julian, I guess, to call the therapy Avatar. I mean, is it barely to do with the use of the avatar, or there is more behind the story?
There's a bit more behind the story. So Julian chose it not because of the Avatar film, which many people think, oh, it came out around the time, remember the famous film of Avatar. But he chose it because of the relationship of avatars in Indian mythology to spiritual experience. And that's why he chose it. He had the idea from, he always said to me, and he showed me pictures of these things he'd collected on his travels in India of these wooden representations of the avatar. So the idea was that the avatar was a representation of this otherwise intangible object, this thing in the person's unconscious, if you like, and was a way of making it real for the individual. He made the point that you can't have a conversation properly with a disembodied voice, but you can have a conversation with a face, especially if it responds to you. That's how we behave as humans. We're doing it now. We're looking at each other and having a conversation. So that was the insight Avatar from that, and then the implementation.
It's very interesting because actually Tara, who asked, is one of the two attendees who asked the question. She was wondering about the Hindu connection to the name. Yeah. So great to know that Tara was right. Yeah. And then there is a question, Tom, that is more broadly about auditory hallucination, and is to do with the two mainstream theory of the pathogenesis, the neurological and the cognitive. And the question to you is, what's your opinion on these two different theories?
Well, I have no doubt that there's a biological basis for experiencing, for the disassociation of your inner thoughts from, the difference between a voice and your inner thoughts. The voices are your inner thoughts. And the mechanism that's going wrong, if you like, I'm sure is a biological mechanism that makes you less able to spot this as being something belonging to yourself. And perhaps all Avatar is doing is shifting, and that's what we see. We see people very often, we're ending up saying, I only say the things you think about yourselves, and that becomes a bit of a penny dropping for the individual. So I know those theories. I think they're broadly right.
And Tom, there is a question from Annabelle, who is saying, do you match the sex of the therapist to the sex of the patient? And also Annabelle was saying, are there any training open to psychiatrists or mental health professional through the service?
Okay, so no, we don't match, because the voice can the voice transform software can do it. So the voice can turn me into anything. So we don't explicitly match. And no, you can't get training unless you're in one of the participating centers. That's an absolute condition of the Wellcome Award, is that we can only deliver the therapy and research it in the centers they've approved. So eventually one hopes, yes, that this is all heading to the point where we can, where it can be taken on and just rolled out to anyone that's interested.
And there is a more sort of general question from Richard, pointing out that the avatar, I guess, therapy is an example of collaboration of clinician with software engineers, and he's wondering, is there any other example in progress that you are aware of? I mean, I can think about Lucia Valmaggia and the virtual reality, but you would know more.
Yeah, there are. So there's a group in Canada who have replicated Julian's original pilot, an absolute copy of his original study using immersive VR. And they are just moving to the sort of phase 2 trial we did. And Marita Nordentoft in Denmark has just started a trial with first episode Psychosis using, again, immersive VR. And the group in the Netherlands, Wim, of surname that escapes me for a minute, they've just got funding to do a trial. So it's beginning to bubble up in other places. Interestingly enough, the Americans that I've spoken to, there's been several groups that reached out and expressed interest. They've not taken it on at all. They've been very skeptical about the psychological benefits of psychological therapy and psychosis. And in the end, not as far as I know, none of them have taken it on.
I wonder, Tom, if that's because the American model of psychosis is such a biological one, that the idea that by psychological intervention and changing beliefs that you could actually...
I'm absolutely convinced that's the case, Robin. It seems to be blinded by the fact that our brains are molded by our experiences and also molded experiences. It's got to have both bits. It cannot possibly be just one mechanism. It must be. Anyway, there we are. That's another whole story. But I think that is true. That was the main objection.
So, Tom, more you talk, more questions come along. So I'm going to summarize some of them. Otherwise, we probably spend all afternoon on this, which is great. So question is, what type of work is done in preparation of the actual first avatar session in terms of getting to know the patient and building a relationship? And the point of this question is, do you actually already know what to expect in the interaction between the avatar and the patient?
The first part answer to the first part of that question is easy, which is we know because all the patients that came in were patients of the trust, of the mental health services. So we had good documentation on the basic nature of the condition. We then did about a 1-hour interview assessment, gathering what we could. And the person sits with the therapist to design the avatar. It's collaborative, and you build the avatar together, both choosing what the voice sounds like and choosing the face. The second question, I can't remember the second one now, but I know it immediately. I thought, oh my goodness, that's much harder.
No, the second one links a bit to what you said. So how much do you know before the first session about what to expect from the dialogue?
Yeah.
But you answered it in some way.
You know a lot, but it's often incomplete, and you often get it completely wrong. So it's not at all unusual for the patient to say, yeah, my voice would never say that. Okay. You're just completely, that's just foolish. It wouldn't do that. And then you have to back down. I should say that people do know they're talking. At no point in this are you pretending that the avatar is real. People know it's a construction, and they know that it is the therapist acting. In the therapy, they completely forget that. So within minutes into it, they're in the discussion and they've forgotten that this thing isn't real. But at another level, they do.
And this is a question that links a little bit to the setting of where the therapy takes place. And it's about, so the question says, it appears to me that the therapist is engaging with the patient without being face-to-face, and my corrector is too simplistic. And the point is, could it be that the fact that you don't actually have this face-to-face interaction, but it's by the avatar, that the therapist can say things or respond more directly than we would normally do?
That's certainly true. You start off together. So a typical session is meet together. What's it been like this week? Any new experiences? How are you feeling? Blah, blah, blah. Then into the avatar, which is separate rooms, and then back together at the end to say, how was it? How did you experience that? Maybe sometimes even listening to some of the recording together again. So it's much more interactive than my talk makes it be. But I think we think the separation is really important. Now, I know there are groups out there. There have been discussions, I've had discussions in Maritli, for instance, about whether the therapist should be in the virtual world as a kind of a handholder with the patient, and I don't know. So that's what she's going to try. I don't know.
And I guess the last two questions. One, Tom, is which I guess is a must question. Have you, is there any development or plan to look at treatment of auditory hallucination across diagnosis, for instance, bipolar depression?
Yeah, well, yes and no. So in our first trial, we were focused on this treatment-resistant group. The current trial, it's anybody with a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, so schizophrenia, psychotic depression, or bipolar disorder with voices, but not EUPD, not, well, there's a very interesting one. Here's a quick question actually for Robin and all of you. We have a guy who's been referred to as with Di Giorgi syndrome, which is one of these chromosome deletion things. Now we've said not organic disorder. So do we exclude him or do we keep him in? And if we keep him in, are we opening a floodgate to a lot of others?
I will keep him in, but anyway.
Oh, that's very interesting. Indeed, Tom, there's a very interesting paper out from Oliver Howe's group showing that such patients, before they develop psychosis, have increased striatal dopamine. And of course, many of our patients have that. So yeah. I don't see why you shouldn't. It'd be tremendously interesting to try, though probably you get into trouble with referees.
Possibly, but we could still try, I think.
Yes,
I think so. Thank you. Well, you just resolved an issue for me, so I can take that back to the to the group when we meet.
And Tom, the last point, which I left last intentionally, is from Anita saying she knows from Julian himself that he actually got the idea about developing the avatar from talking to his son. Who I think is with us today. John, I don't know if you want to comment on this.
I think Julian discussed his ideas with all of us, but the ideas were very much his own.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. And thank you, Tom, for answering these great questions.
A pleasure. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Tom. You've got us off to a very good start. And as we've learned, you can ask your questions. It's really too complicated for us to look through hundreds and hundreds of people to see whether they have their hands up. So it's better to ask in the Q&A. So on we go. And next introduction will be by Paula Dazan, who is now the Vice Dean of the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College, but once upon a time was a research fellow and a PhD student with our next speaker together under Julian's overall supervision. Paula.
Thank you, Robin. Yes, as you say, I'm now an established academic at the Institute of Psychiatry, but in fact, I met the next speaker, when we both started our PhD back in 1998. So the next speaker is Professor Craig Morgan, Professor of Social Epidemiology and co-director of the ESRC Center for Society and Mental Health. So when we started our PhD, I had an interest in the biological part and he had an interest in the social part. And I suppose we were really reflecting what the MRC had asked Robin and Julian to work on. And since then, we shared many, many hours. In fact, for 3 years, we sat in these consensus meetings that I remember with Julian, and we were learning from the many anecdotes that he always had about his clinical experience and his clinical cases. And sometimes he would brought out pieces of papers from many years before that he had carefully stored And I remember learning a lot of my psychopathology from him. And 10 years later, we followed up the original cohort that was the ESOP cohort. And I'm sure Craig will tell you more about this in the next 45 minutes. And we're now thinking of a 25-year follow-up, which will be the next step in what has been really an incredibly collaborative and successful study, a legacy to Julian and the MRC vision that Robin mentioned just earlier today. So let's hear about the findings from the first 10 years, I think, of the ESOP study from Craig.
Thanks very much, Paola. I will now try to share my screen and hopefully that will work. Actually, I'm hoping that you can now all see this. Brilliant, wonderful, thank you. And I actually just in preparing and thinking about this, I guess it is a time when we all sort of reflect a little bit. And I actually remember the first time I encountered Julian was at my interview for an MRC PhD studentship at the IOP. And the way that it used to work in those days, I think still does to a degree, is that there were a selection of projects. And then you had to choose which of the projects you wanted to do. And in making the application, I'd hedge my bets and put two different projects. And at the end of the interview, David Goldberg, who was chairing the interview panel, came out after me very quickly and insisted that I tell him which of these two projects I was going to do. And of course, the simple reason why I chose the one with Julian was because I'd heard of Julian. I knew of Julian's work and so on. So it almost didn't happen, which is quite incredible to think, given everything that has come from ESOP and certainly the role that I've had the real privilege to play with ESOP. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk at this symposium, a privilege and an honor to contribute, to pay tribute to Julian's contributions and legacy. And I actually want to start by going back and rewinding back to 1997, which was quite a momentous year, but certainly in the UK. And actually, I guess in now looking at this is a very UK focused. It was a year when J.K. Rowling first published the first Harry Potter book. At the Spice Girls had their first single. This may not mean anything to an international audience. I don't know how popular the Spice Girls were. The Titanic claimed all the Oscars. Colleagues at the IOP may not remember, this is the year that the IOP became part of King's. And also, and congratulations to all the Italian colleagues here. This was the last time the UK won the Eurovision Song Contest. Something that I don't think there's much chance that we will ever do again. And it was also the year that the UK Labour Party won a landslide election. And in 18 years of Conservative ruling, it was really interesting to hear Joan talk about Julian's interests and work around social justice and so on. And I'm sure that, like many of us, would have been very pleased to have seen the end of that Conservative government. But also in 1997, schizophrenia was a genetic brain disorder, or predominantly a genetic brain disorder. That was the consequence of the unfolding of neurodevelopmental processes that kind of unfolded over time, culminating during early adulthood in the onset of symptoms. It was a relatively rare disorder, affecting maybe about 0.5% of the population over their lifetime. Had a uniform worldwide incidence from the best epidemiological evidence available at the time. And the consensus was that the onset was largely unaffected by social environments, and that the long-term course was very pessimistic and largely chronic. And it was also in 1997 that the ESOP study started. It was a study, as Robin has already mentioned, that began with Julian and Robin coming together, but it also extended and included and eventually became a 3-centre study in Nottingham, Bristol and South London, with Peter Jones leading in Nottingham and Glyn Harrison leading in Bristol. And just to give a bit of a context to this, it's a first episode Psychosis study, or it was when it was set up, when its purpose was to estimate incidence rates, compare these by ethnic group, and to then investigate the influence of social and biological factors. And I guess this is the coming together that Robin has talked about. And at at the level of PhD students, myself and Paolo, I guess, embodied that coming together of the social and the biological at the time, and ultimately comprised a sample of around about 500 individuals with the first episode psychosis, around about 400 controls. And what I want to do in this talk is I want to highlight several contributions that I think Aesop has made to our understanding of psychosis, and to shifting our understanding of psychosis from that was common and around which there was consensus in the late 1990s. And I guess from this to kind of illustrate how this stimulated and also provided a template for subsequent studies that have continued to pick up on some of these themes and further expand our understanding. And I hope what this will do is show how Julian's legacy rests both on the research that he did and that he led, but also on the subsequent research and generations of researchers that his work has inspired. And in this, and I guess in preparing for it, there's more left out of this than is included. I spent this morning taking out all the slides that could have been included. And I guess one thing that, as a consequence of that, I'm not going to be able to say much about is the whole set of neuroimaging and other biological research done as part of Aesop, and that was subsequently stimulated by Aesop, much of this led by Paula. But what I can say is that the approach that we adopted in Aesop, or that was adopted by Robin and Julian in Aesop, of combining within single studies assessments of the biological, psychological, and social, and so on, is something that's continued, certainly through the work that has been done at the Institute of Psychiatry and so on, but also way beyond that. So the areas that I want to focus on and reflect on and say a little bit about is in relation to population rates of psychotic disorders, a little bit about phenomenology or symptoms. I'm not going to say too much about that, about social risks, and about course and outcome. And this is really about giving some kind of flavor of the findings that have emerged from Aesop, how they've informed the development of subsequent studies and been expanded by those, and what that now tells us about psychotic disorders and how our understanding has consequently shifted. So to begin with the population rates of psychoses, where I want to start is by highlighting the I think was the first major paper from Aesop, led by James Kirkbride and Peter Jones, which presented data on the incidence of psychoses, and in particular comparisons between London, Nottingham, and Bristol. And what this clearly showed is that rates of psychosis were much higher in London compared with Nottingham and with Bristol. And this kind of fed into and was part of a series of studies at the time that were suggesting that rates of psychotic disorders were higher in more densely populated urban areas than they were in more rural or less urbanized areas. So that was one initial finding in relation to incidence. And I guess the second main finding in relation to incidence was the findings concerning migrant and minority populations. What we found in Aesop was that the incidence of psychotic disorders was around about 4 to 6 times higher in the Black Caribbean and Black African populations compared with the white British. And I think the step forward that Aesop took in relation to this, because this is a finding that had been observed in a number of previous studies, I think that the steps forward that the Aesop study took were in its methodology, the extent to which the case finding was comprehensive, the extent to which we covered a wider range of services, but also in taking account, for example, of ethnicity in the process that Paolo has talked about, the kind of very detailed diagnostic process that we went through to try to kind of address some of the previous limitations or some of the controversies around whether or not this could be explained by misdiagnosis or not. And of course, the reason why these sorts of variations in incidence are important is because they give us potential clues about etiology. So understanding variation in incidence can be important for understanding what it is that drives and underpins the onset of disorders. And work that is developed from this, a lot of work from this has adopted the methodology that Aesop adopted and used, and applied it in a whole range of other settings. And I think I wanted to kind of highlight 2 recent studies that are kind of directly linked back to the methodologies that Aesop used, but which have extended, either confirmed or extended the findings from Aesop. And of course, I guess that to say in all of this, what I'm doing here is kind of highlighting the contributions that ESOP in particular have made and the extent to which ESOP has fed into these studies. But of course, there's a whole range of other studies as well by colleagues in other groups that at the same time are contributing to and feeding into this. So this is the EU GI study set up by Jim van Os and colleagues from the Netherlands. And as part of that, we conducted an incidence and a case control study in 16 centres in 6 countries, including 5 in Europe and in Brazil. In total, we had around about 2,000 cases of first episode psychosis, around about 1,000 controls. And again, in work led by Hannah Jongsma and supervised by James Kirkbride, we found marked variations. So when you look at the incidence across these different sites, there's something like an 8-fold variation in the incidence of psychosis, from 6 in Santiago in Spain to 46.1 in Paris in France. So really quite marked variation. We also similarly found, and Jean-Paul Selton and colleagues in the Netherlands have led the analyses of data from this study on this, that across all migrant and minority populations, there's around about a 2-fold increased incidence of psychoses. I think one thing to highlight from this, and that I didn't mention in relation to ESOP, is that this increased incidence does vary for different populations. So in the ESOP study, for example, we didn't find any evidence of high rates amongst some populations from, say, the Indian subcontinent, although other studies have subsequently cast some nuance on that. But it's the same here, that there's actually variation across this. So I don't think we should necessarily assume that there is a single migrant effect, but actually, nonetheless, there is strong evidence that among some groups, at least, that the incidence is elevated. But I think most interestingly from this is the evidence that when we compared in each of the countries, more urban with more rural sites, what we found, or what Hannah in her work found, was that the disparity between urban and rural largely held for the Northern European countries, but not necessarily so for the Southern European countries. And there's been subsequent work that suggests, in fact, the urbanicity effect that I think we've assumed to be universal. When you begin to cast the lens much wider and begin to look at more diverse settings and countries, that urban effect is possibly a Northern European effect. And that again is particularly interesting in terms of trying to understand what that tells us about possible etiology. And that kind of leads me on to the final study that I wanted to mention in relation to incidence, and drawing from the design of ESOP, taking our lead partly from the findings from the EU GI study, but also from ESOP. We've, with support again from the Medical Research Council in the UK, who supported the ESOP study, we've extended to conduct studies now in India, in southern India, in Chennai, in Nigeria, and in Trinidad. And in fact, the choice of these 3 settings is because the main migrant groups to the UK in ESOP were from the Indian subcontinent, from West Africa, and from the Caribbean. And of course, in fact, there are stronger threads even still. So in Trinidad, our main collaborator is Jared Hutchinson, who worked on ESOP right back at the beginning of the study. And so these threads, as Paola said, continue to span out. And in Nigeria, it's led by Oye Gureje and by Dr. Tara in Chennai. And these are very preliminary data, but when we look at the incidence, this is incidence based on case finding over a 2-year period, really quite extensive case finding, looking beyond services to identify people also through traditional spiritual healers and through community and key informants. There seems to be pretty strong evidence that the incidence is much higher in Trinidad than it is in India and Nigeria. But interestingly, I think here, and not shown, there are actually differences across the centres in the patterns of incidence by age and by gender. And again, this comes back to some of the kind of universality of the findings that we have from Northern Europe and from the US and maybe Australia, and our assumption that these necessarily extend to and describe what psychosis is like, its manifestations and its patterns and so on across the rest of the world. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. And so this work, which directly leads out and draws from ESOP, I think is beginning to question some of those accepted findings. And so in a sense that this whole approach continues to challenge our current understandings of psychotic disorders. I just want to turn very briefly from that, it's not only the incidence or the occurrence of disorder that varies across populations and by social group, but it's also symptoms and phenomenology. And I want to illustrate this in relation to some findings from ESOP, actually findings that we haven't published as of yet. This is comparing symptom dimensions and particular symptoms by ethnic groups. So the BC here is Black Caribbean and the WB is White British, just to be able to fit it onto the slide. 5 typical dimensions identified for people with psychotic illness, disorganized, positive, negative, depressive, manic. And this is kind of comparing the presence or absence of any of these symptoms and also the severity using the score. And I hope what you can see from this is that positive symptoms are more common among the Black Caribbean and Black African populations relative to the White British. Negative symptoms for Black Caribbean, for Black people of Black Caribbean heritage are less common. And then when you look at that, when you look at that by specific symptoms, the specific kinds of positive symptoms that appear to be elevated and increased amongst these groups are delusions of reference and persecution and non-affective auditory hallucinations. Quite interesting, Tom, thinking about Avatar in relation to some of this and the kind of cultural sensitivity or otherwise of Avatar. It'd be interesting to know if there's anything planned or any work in relation to that. But again, the interest in this, I think, is that it begins to suggest some possible variations, or variations in what might underlie the onset of these disorders and particular symptoms. And you can begin to think of why it might be that there are more positive symptoms amongst some groups, if, for example, these are driven by social experiences that link to experiences of a threat and so on, which I guess is now where I want to come on to. And this now is so to kind of move on to the sort of social and to social risks and so on. This is very much an area that was central to Julian's work. And an interest in the impacts of social worlds on mental life and mental states is something that ran through almost all that Julian did. And of course, this is the focus that Julian very much brought to ESOP. And in fact, prior to ESOP starting, and I think in preparation for the MRC grant, that I'm assuming is the one that initially failed until the MRC forced Robin and Julian to work together. Julian with Rosemary Mallet, who went on to coordinate ESOP, and Dinesh Bugra conducted a smaller study looking at issues of ethnicity and the impacts of the social environment and so on. And amongst a range of things, what they found in this study was an association between early separation from parents and psychotic disorder. A finding that kind of hints at the possibility that there is something occurring in childhood, that childhood adversity broadly defined might be relevant in relation to psychosis. And of course, to kind of go back to where I started, around about this time, this was not something that was commonly considered a possibility. It was not something that was part of understandings of psychotic disorder. But of course, in the time since, there has been lots of work, and part of it coming out of ESOP, but also a huge explosion of interest in the relationship between various forms of adversity and psychotic disorders. In the ESOP study, the initial finding from the small study that preceded it was replicated, finding that those with a psychotic disorder were around about three times more likely to have lived in households growing up that fractured or where there was separation and loss. And of course, this is kind of hinting at problems and difficulties in childhood being linked to psychotic disorder, rather than suggesting that these in and of themselves are what are driving an increase. And of course, what has flowed out of this is a particular interest in broadly childhood adversity, but a particular interest in more specifically extreme forms of childhood adversity and childhood abuse. And it is quite striking to remember back to when ESOP was set up, that measures of childhood abuse were included. And although now it seems widely accepted that childhood adversities and childhood abuse are important in the onset of psychosis, it really wasn't true at the time. And there's a tremendous amount of foresight in including measures of childhood adversity and childhood abuse at that time. And this slide shows findings from analyses of ESOP data that Helen Fisher completed, which essentially gives a hint that there is an association, particularly for physical abuse with psychotic disorders, but particularly amongst women or girls who have experienced abuse later developing psychotic disorder. And I think this is an issue that has not perhaps been taken up as much as might be warranted, given what we know about the kind of prevalence and the patterns of these forms of abuse by gender. But it's certainly something worth exploring. But of course, and the main point from this is that this work then stimulates and has stimulated much further research, trying to understand what the impacts might be, and more specificity about the nature of the association and the relationship between forms of childhood adversity and subsequent psychosis. And one study that drew and kind of emerged from out of this was a study that we were fortunate to get funded by the Wellcome Trust, really with the rationale that what we wanted to do was to investigate in much more detail issues of the timing, the duration, the frequency of abuse, the severity of abuse, with the question being, is there anything in that, in more frequent, more severe forms of abuse that might link specifically to psychotic disorder? And this was a study then that we managed to complete with around about 300 individuals to the first episode of psychosis, around 300 controls. Huge amount of information on early childhood experiences collected in depth through really quite thorough interviews. And I just wanted to kind of highlight one finding from this. And firstly, what you hopefully can see from this is that overall, each of the forms of abuse and discord and adversity that we looked at were associated with a 2- to 4-fold increased odds of psychotic disorder. But what was interesting is when we split this then down by severity, is that we found for some forms of abuse and adversity, the strongest effects were for the most severe forms of abuse. And in particular, for example, if you look at household discord, where there's a tremendous amount of upset, arguments, for example, and so on in the household, that in and of itself appears not to be associated with a subsequent increased risk of psychotic disorder, but it's where there's violence in the household, where there's domestic violence. And so what this is hinting at is that there may be some level of specificity for experiences and contexts that involve particularly threat, severe hostility, and so on in relation to psychotic disorders. That if, and actually what these broad main effects are picking up are that also in amongst those are some people who have experienced very severe forms of adversity and abuse. So this is really a kind of example of taking findings from ESOP, them informing subsequent studies where then we try to address more detailed and in-depth questions. And there's a couple of other elements to this. Others have found this as well. It appears that the more adversities, the greater the risk. So it's not just about a specific exposure, it's about multiple exposures to adversities over time. And it's not just childhood adversities. It appears that one possible way in which childhood adversities might link to later disorder is to increase vulnerability in the event of future stressors. And all that this slide shows, although it looks a little bit complicated, if you look at the bar on the right-hand side, is showing that the cumulative combined effect of early and later adversity and stress is much greater than the effect of each alone. So it's as if the fact of having experienced early adversity makes individuals more vulnerable in the event of further adversity and stress to developing the kinds of experiences and so on that when they occur together and become persistent and distressing, we consider to be indicators of psychotic disorder. Okay, and finally, and I guess from this you get a slight sense of the sheer breadth of Julian's work and interests and so on. Of course, Tom has already talked very much about the kind of interest in developing therapies and so on. But Julian was also very much interested in course and outcome, and this links to the work on intervention. And so it's very natural for us to have then sought to follow the ESOP cohort. It took time to do this, and eventually when we did, it was a 10-year follow-up. And I just want to say a little bit about some of the findings from this 10-year follow-up. Firstly, as many others have found, and quite sobering, we also found that rates of mortality are much higher amongst people who develop a psychotic disorder over time. In ESOP, around about 3 to 4 times higher than that for the general population, particularly for unnatural causes, which I guess tragically means suicide often. But also when looking at symptoms and the long-term course and outcome, we found, and others have found this, really quite marked variability in the course and outcome of a first episode psychosis. Only about 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 would experience a long-term chronic unremitting course of symptoms. For the majority, the typical course was more punctuated by periods of being symptom-free, and for around about a third, no one had an episode of more than 6 months, although they may have had multiple episodes. There's about 10-15% who had 1 episode at baseline and never had another episode. And at follow-up, around about 50% have been symptom-free for 2 years prior to follow-up. So perhaps not quite, when you take an epidemiological sample, not quite the pessimistic view of course and outcome that I don't know if commonly, but certainly is held and seen by some. But in this study, we were also particularly interested in ethnicity, and I'm going to finish really on this to kind of come back to the questions of ethnicity. So we've seen that there are high rates of disorder. It's a critically important question of what then subsequently happens, and are outcomes better or worse? And the data from ESOP, at least in terms of symptoms, suggests that the outcomes are somewhat worse, that those of Black Caribbean and Black African ethnicity are more likely to experience a continuous course, certainly for the Caribbean population. And there are different ways of categorizing this, but if you also compare those who have kind of fall in the middle with episodic, you also see again that there's more from the Black Caribbean group in particular who fall into that group. And this extends to social outcomes. Social outcomes, and I've kind of painted a slightly optimistic picture when it comes to symptomatic outcomes. That's certainly not possible in relation to social outcomes. Social outcomes for people with a psychotic disorder are pretty bad, and uniformly so. This slide shows, for example, that only about 1 in 5 were employed at follow-up. Around about 70% have been employed for less than 75% of the follow-up. So if you take employment as a marker of social function and so on, very poor social outcomes. And from that poor base, that the outcomes socially were worse even still for Black Caribbean and Black African patients in the sample. And of course, this is important because this links to services, service development and so on. And it highlights that there is still a tremendous amount of way to go for us to, in relation to providing services for people from more diverse social and ethnic backgrounds. So, and I'm not entirely sure how I'm doing with time. I hope that I'm on time. So where are we now in terms of psychosis? What's our understanding of psychosis now? Well, I think now we're at a point where we consider psychoses, or can consider psychosis, to be neurosociodevelopmental disorders influenced by social and biological factors which interact over the course of development in the onset of disorders. One thing that I didn't really have much of a chance to talk about is the fact that we broaden our gaze to all psychoses. These disorders are not that uncommon, and also experiences of psychosis which don't quite meet threshold criteria for disorder, actually quite common in populations. The incidence varies widely across contexts and across groups, and it seems like social context experiences people's lives matter in the onset of psychosis, and that the long-term course of psychosis is variable. So I hope that this gives a flavor, and in its best, it is a flavor of the range of findings that ESOP has generated and the range of subsequent work that it's stimulated. Our understanding of psychosis is quite different, I think, now than it was in 1997. And ESOP and its offspring, to use a title, that is work done and inspired by Julian, I think has made a seminal contribution to this. So it's a privilege to have had the opportunity to work with Julian and to take some of this work forward with so many talented colleagues over the past years. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Craig, for a wonderful review of the ESOP findings and the findings stimulated by Julian's work and by the initial ESOP studies. it is astonishing when we think of how so much social factors have come to the fore. When I was applying to the MRC in the early 90s, I didn't bother with any social factors, but Julian and Dinesh and Rosemary Mallet were already looking at social factors. And I always illustrate how unusual this was by, and you know this, Craig, mentioning that when we went to the then biannual conference in Davos, where people went to learn about schizophrenia and also to ski, Rosemary had a terrible time because, first of all, she was a sociologist, and there were no other sociologists there. Secondly, she couldn't ski. And thirdly, she was Black, and there were no other Black people there. The only poster, I think, that mentioned social or it was hers, maybe with you, Craig. But now you go to any psychosis conference, there's lots and lots of studies on social factors of childhood adversity and likewise. So it's produced a whole shift. Questions, Marta? Are there? Do you want to comment on?
Yes, there are questions for Craig. So Craig, the first one is, are there actually enough evidence for large variation in incidence across the world? This question came at 2:19, so maybe by now they are convinced, but you might want to add something to this.
I think there is. I do. I mean, I guess there's evidence that it varies by group. The findings in relation to migrant minority ethnic groups have been around for so long and continually repeated, and maybe there are some methodological kind of issues that underlie that still, and maybe misdiagnosis is relevant. But I think the weight is such that the evidence is that there is high levels of distress relative to other populations in these groups, and certainly globally, as the evidence begins to develop and emerge, there seems to be quite wide variation. And again, some of this may well be due to methodological differences, but I guess the thing that really came from ESOP, and we've tried to then apply in the EUGI study and now in this Intrepid study and in other contexts, is a concern for trying to address those methodological issues, to be as comprehensive as possible in case findings, so that we can be confident that what we're observing is at least a reflection of variations in patterns. And I think and that they're comparable, genuinely comparable. So my reading of the evidence is that, yeah, there is probably sufficient now to say that there is variation.
So everybody, of course, has their biases, Craig, and you managed to talk about ESOP, EUGI, and Intrepid without mentioning the other important risk factor, cannabis use. We weren't clever enough to think about it at ESOP, but it contributes to the geographic variation in the EUGI and maybe also in Trinidad.
Yeah, and I guess the really interesting thing about these variations then is that it offers us, windows into trying to understand onset. And so what's the different distribution of risks in the settings that might explain why there are high rates in some places and not in others? And cannabis is absolutely, I think, a candidate for this in Trinidad. They're also Trinidad is very much a sort of society in to a large degree in a kind of process of development and transition, and huge inequalities and so on, and partly as a consequence, high levels of interpersonal violence, trauma, and so on. So I think it's looking at how we explain these variations that then also possibly helps us in terms of further understanding what really is causing these disorders. I don't know, Robin, if you wanted kind of to reflect on why it was we didn't have cannabis in the ESOP study, or why we didn't.
No, it was pretty clear that we didn't think that cannabis. We were busy telling the poor relatives of psychotic patients when the mum or the brother mentioned, why could my son or brother's illness have anything to do with the amount of cannabis he's smoking? smoking 10 joints a day, because we would say, no, cannabis is an entirely safe drug. Just be glad he's not taking anything serious like alcohol. No, so looking back, one realizes how ignorant we were. I suppose the question is, how ignorant are we now? What are we missing? What are we missing now? Marta,
and I think, yeah, linking to your point, what are we missing now? That's a very interesting suggestion about why perhaps the rates are higher in larger cities, Craig. And he's saying, could it be that it's to do with the many extra sensory stimuli that people are exposed in large cities, like noises, heavy car traffic, possibly causing worsening of, for instance, auditory hallucination, which is something that forever I think about when I go and do home visit in inner city London. I wonder, is it possible to remain sane? So, Craig.
Yeah, and I think that there's emerging work linking and looking at, for example, pollution in cities with mental health and with psychotic, low-level kind of psychotic experiences. And of course, pollution will co-occur with all of these kinds of sensory overloads, because for there to be lots of pollution, you generally need to have lots of cars and things like that. So what is driving this, and which aspects of cities are important, is something that we still really need to kind of work out. But I think that it seems clear that there's lots of kinds of exposures like this that will contribute. I don't think that there's a single explanation for any of these sorts of phenomena. I think it's likely to be a whole range of factors that come together. And then the question is, what kind of processes and mechanisms are they impacting on that then increase risk of psychosis? And certainly that is one possibility. And the greater exposure to threat is another possibility. More cannabis use and so on is another possibility. So there's a whole range that I think we should be considering.
And
do you think, can I, sorry, being the chairman gets me this.
I think, Chairman, maybe you should write your questions in the chat and then I'll decide if to read them or not.
Well, next one. Craig, the other question is, if you read the textbooks, they all say the incidence is higher in big cities. But what about Southern Europe, and what about Sao Paulo, one of the biggest cities in the world, had low incidence?
I think it's tantalizing. I think the big unknown is whether this is a methodological artifact, whether we're more successful at finding people in certain places. For example, where we've been doing studies for 20 years, we're more successful at finding them than where we've just started to do studies. And so I think that's something that we need to look at. But if it is that there is genuinely a lower incidence in cities, then again, what is it that's specific about Northern European cities that might be driving higher rates? And that's a window, that's an opportunity to try to understand a little bit more about why these disorders occur.
And Craig, another suggestion comes from Susanna, saying, and she's linking particularly to your data on separation of family, and she's thinking about what might have been the impact of family separation during the Windrush, and the bearing, of course, of childhood adversity, especially when we think about our London population.
Yeah, that is an interesting question, and maybe and Tom might have something to kind of add on that. But I guess just to slightly sidestep the question, but also to bring in a little bit more some of Julian's thinking around this. Julian was also very interested, and I've not talked about this, but the kind of cultural dissonance that there was for migrants, particularly migrants from the Caribbean, for whom the UK was the kind of the homeland. It was kind of coming to the UK in the post-war period. But of course, the experience once arriving in the UK was really quite dramatically different, and that left many with a sense of neither belonging to where they had migrated from, but nor being accepted to where they'd migrated. And that kind of dissonance and ambivalence about cultural identity also being something that might underpin and explain why there are higher levels of psychotic experiences and symptoms and so on in some groups. And but I don't know, Tom, if you wanted to kind of say anything on that.
No, I think you're absolutely spot on that it was that dissonance, and there are multiple hardships. So very often you'd get mum and dad would come over to England, settle. The daughter would be left with granny. There might well have been abuse and neglect in granny's household. That was not uncommon. Some siblings came over early and did well, then this sibling would come across and wouldn't do as well, didn't have as much resources. So it's a whole mix of things, which I think is early adversity and this complete dislocation from what was supposed to be the promised land to what was in reality something very, very different.
And you have some data, Craig, do you not, that maybe the high incidence in the Black Caribbean people in the UK is beginning to come down?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because partly to this kind of universalism, we have a finding that then is kind of immortal and it sort of is set in time. But why wouldn't it be that the disparities would be changing over time? Yeah. The challenge is that we don't do the studies kind of often enough. We don't really have a routine way of tracking to know.
Yeah.
And so then you've got things like kind of sampling variation and so on, which might explain differences. And so possibly from the most recent stuff, actually from the EU GI data, specifically in London, that the disparities are not nearly as marked as they were in ESOP. But to make the leap that that's because they're kind of coming down, I think is, without more data points, is a challenge.
I mean, the other thing was Sherry's data, which was using the CRIS system, which is just within SLAM and within the admission rates. It was coming down if you took that as the marker of incidence first admission. So
and it's also the cities are enormously different, and one cannot really compare cities in different places. They're different settings altogether. So saying urbanicity is far too complex a variable to take into account.
And I think there is actually a question. And I think there is a question that touches on what Professor Sartorius has just mentioned, from Manuela saying, would the stronger social family network, possibly greater in some cities like Southern Europe or even South America, be a protective factor, and therefore this might explain, other than methodological issues, the low incidence in these big cities?
Yeah, I think that's possible, and that point and Professor Sartorius's point as well, I think is really important, because what we need is to now get to the specifics of what is happening, and so we can understand why there are variations. I think I guess too, with some of the work on the social in relation to psychotic disorders, it is still very, very new. And I think we kind of, it's useful to remind ourselves of this, because we've got some broad outlines, higher in some cities, higher among some groups and so on, then hypotheses about the kind of processes that might underpin this, and some data related to some of those, particularly around childhood adversities and abuses and so on. But what we don't really much have is any real solid analyses or published data on protective factors and what might be mitigating some of these the impacts of some of these harsh environments on people's mental lives and well-being and so on. And so it's absolutely a really, I think, important avenue for what comes next.
And Craig, I know in terms of Intrepid, you sort of early stage analysis, but there is a question from Richard saying, referring to the point of high rates in the Caribbean, and mentioning, could the cultural transmission of slavery waive a contribution?
Possibly. I mean, I guess this is where I just would love for my colleague Gerard to be here, who would have a much better response to this and a much better understanding of that kind of historical context and how it impacts and continues to impact in the Caribbean, and particularly in Trinidad. But I guess, Tom, I keep coming back to you partly because you mentioned your Jamaican heritage, and I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
It must do. at one level. It's part of the discourse, isn't it? It's part of, why am I persecuted? Why do people, why am I excluded? Why, the other finding that you haven't mentioned, Craig, but I always think is so fascinating is this higher rates of psychosis among minorities who are living in predominantly non-minority areas. And that sort of fits into this. And there's a history of these dreadful people have been treating you like this forever. But where that then starts to break down, I think, is North America. You have to ask questions about different rates of psychosis in minority groups in North America, where I think the epidemiology hasn't been, well, as I've read it, hasn't been quite as good in terms of looking at those social factors there.
And actually, Craig and Tom, given that you're doing a double act with these questions, this goes back to some points that you raised, Tom. Question is, has anybody looked at more details behind the issue of migration? For instance, is there any difference in migrating alone rather than with family, or expectation or reason why people migrate?
I don't know.
I mean, I think one answer to that is to point to the post-war migration, which was mass and was in search of work and so on. And so I mean, I don't know if this is where the questioner is potentially kind of looking to, but I think for that reason, it's highly unlikely that people who were more vulnerable to develop serious mental disorders were migrating. But I think if it's more to do with the kind of expectations of migration and then the impact of those being not being met, then I think absolutely that is the loss of position, sense of self-worth and so on that comes from that mismatch between expectation, I think, is potentially quite high. And if it's okay, just very quickly, one bit in relation to kind of historical, in relation to slavery and racism and so on. And I think it's partly that background, that history for young people growing up in that kind of context, and with that sort of history, there is a sense in which people understand that their experiences of disadvantage and adversity are rooted in systematic injustices and disadvantages and so on, and so that the system that the out there is responsible, and I think quite rightly, and so that often and can manifest itself in terms of kind of outward expression of distress in terms of the other. And then you can think about sort of psychological pathways from that through repeated difficulties and experiences to some of the phenomena of psychosis, like paranoid ideation and so on, which is what we find are higher in some of the in some of the minority groups. I think there is something in that is worth pursuing, and so a reminder of the historical background to all of this is really important.
Thank you, Craig. And actually, James Kirkbride has put on the chat the link to a paper that he has written on family migration and psychosis. And also among our panelists, there is Ilaria Tarricone. Ilaria, you spend your life thinking about migration and psychosis. Do you want to make a brief comment?
Okay, thank you, Marta, for this invitation. Of course, I completely agree with my former supervisor, Professor Craig Morgan, who supervised my work when I did my PhD research at King's College Institute of Psychiatry and Psychological Neuroscience. We actually found also, looking at the data we could evaluate within the UGA project that the mismatch between expectation and achievements is very important, is a crucial point to explain the higher rate of psychosis in first generation migrants, at least. So I completely agree with this explanation.
Thank you very much, Hilaria. And I think there are no more questions, but I would like...
Up.
Sorry?
It's time up, Marta.
No, I just would like to read something very special, and I think John would like to hear this, but I think all of us, given that we are also remembering Julian as a person, not just as an academic. So this is a message from Professor Marthi from Bangalore in India, who said that he has been very grateful to all the work done by Professor Leff. And he's saying, we were very fortunate to see and hear him speaking at Chandigarh on a number of occasions in India. Professor Leff has been an inspiration to me. What was very special is the way he taught me to think of problems in a way. I think of his way of addressing problems using lateral approach to the problem solution when I'm in a blind end and in my work. I've always found new solution. I will miss him. May his soul rest in peace. And I thought that was a special message to share with you all.
Indeed.
Can I add something? That it actually was in Chandigarh where Julian did a study of the difference between rural Chandigarh and urban Chandigarh, which happened to be designed by Le Corbusier. And that's where that idea of urban stress began to arise.
Interesting. So I think we have a break from presentations by disciples of Julian, and we now have a quarter of an hour when you can actually listen to the man himself, because we have some. Joan found a series of videos which Diego will hopefully show. Diego, can you put them on?
Yes, thank you.
We'll come back to the talk at about 4:10.
Mental illness, unlike most other illnesses, has a very heavy stigma. That is, the public have ideas about the mentally ill which are usually incorrect, but label them as dangerous, dirty, difficult to talk to. And these attitudes lead to a distancing between the ordinary person and the person who is mentally ill. So they're seen as the other, not like us, something different. And that led in the old times to the building of large psychiatric hospitals outside of the cities, where mentally ill people were, many of them spent the rest of their lives in these places. We now know that this was very bad for their mental health and their social situation. And many of the Western countries now are doing their best to move people out of these old hospitals and back into society. But you have at least two problems. One is the effect of long-term institutional care on the patients themselves, and the other is the rejecting attitudes of society. And to overcome these, you need to do a lot of different things. You need to change people's attitudes. You need to make employment more available to the mentally ill. Even at the first onset of schizophrenia, around about half the people with the illness are out of work. And as time goes on, the proportion who have no work gets higher and higher, and it's around 80–85%. So this is a dreadful situation. Not only does it deprive them of an income, but it also cuts them off from the social networks that ordinary people develop as part of their working life. In addition to the stigma that is attached to people who are mentally ill but belong to the same ethnic group as the public, if you belong to another ethnic group, particularly if it's identifiable, that is from your skin colour or the clothes you wear or the language you speak, you're identified again as the other, not the same as us. So that if you have both mental illness and ethnic minority status, you have a double helping of stigma, if you like. And that makes it even more difficult to be accepted by the majority culture. The issue of otherness really relates to very basic human instincts. People want to belong to their own group, and they see outsiders as threatening, dangerous. And so it's very easy for a political party that says stop immigration to find support, because they play on the fears of the majority population that their jobs are going to be taken away from them, their women are going to be taken away from them, the people from the ethnic minorities are going to abuse the state privileges. So these all lead to a distancing from the ethnic minority groups, and therefore you have a double distance from the mentally ill and from the ethnic minorities. Each ethnic community has its own concepts, its own ideas about mental illness and its causes. But particularly in traditional societies, mental illness is heavily stigmatized by the group themselves. It's seen as spoiling the marriage chances, not only of the person who's ill, but of all the family members. And so there's often an attempt to keep it as secret as possible. And relatives will not talk about the illness, even to their other close relatives or friends. And this kind of silence around the illness is similar to the silence that we used to have around cancer. It used to be impossible to mention cancer. Now it's become much more open. People realize how important it is to talk about the illness so that it's recognized early, so that you can get good treatment. But the same problem still exists around mental illness. There's a silence around the illness that the family often maintains. And we now know that getting treatment early for severe mental illness can improve the condition more than if you leave the illness untreated for months or even years. Yes, the effect of stigma and the silence around the illness leads to a prolonged period during which the ill person receives no treatment. We've also found in research in London that one of the causes of delay is if the ill person is isolated from their family. If they're close to their family, then usually in time the family will make contact with the services. But if the person who's ill is isolated, it takes much longer for them to get into contact with the services. And during this period, as their illness gets worse, their disturbed behavior becomes public, and they may then enter the system through the police or the courts. And this, of course, is yet another source of stigma. So if that happens, you have three sources of stigma: belonging to an ethnic minority, being mentally ill, and coming into contact with the criminal justice system. One of the best ways of tackling stigma is to try and change the attitudes of the public and the family and the patients themselves. Now that's a very big job. There have been attempts to do this by launching large-scale campaigns using the television, the newspapers, the radio. The problem is that these programs have very little effect, because in order for them to change attitudes, they have to continue for a very long period of time, and they are very, very expensive. It's only the large organizations, commercial organizations, that can afford to keep pushing information at you about their products month after month, year after year. Very difficult for a health service to do that. So what we've learned is that it's much better to work locally with small groups. And there's been a number of studies now through the World Psychiatric Association, particularly in Canada, which have shown that the group that you can change most with these attitudes are high school students. And it's very important to start education while people's minds are still flexible in their early adult life or in their adolescence. So in Canada, they've been running educational programs in the schools and using speakers who themselves have been mentally ill. Now that's a very powerful way of changing attitudes. We know from other research that the more contact you have with the mentally ill, the less intolerant your attitudes are. You learn that these are human beings like yourself. They're not strange people from outer space. So bringing someone into the schools who has had mental illness and can talk about it in a clear way has a very important effect on improving attitudes. And it's a very good idea to develop what's called a speakers bureau. That is, you have a group of people who've had mental illness, who are willing to speak about it, who are trained, because it's not easy for them to speak in public about their illness, and who go out and talk in the schools with the support of professionals who work with them. One of the problems facing mental health professionals in a culture now that is increasingly full of immigrants from other countries. I mean, this is a period of enormous migration all around the world. Millions of people are moving from one culture to another, and probably no place on the globe will be free from this, except perhaps the Amazonian rainforests. But every city in the world will have groups coming from other cultural backgrounds. And this is very difficult for professionals because they've grown up within their own ethnic setting. They probably won't know the languages of the other groups. And yet they have to try and understand the ideas, the beliefs in the other culture, the concepts of mental illness, the attitudes to mental illness. It's an enormous task. If you work, for example, as I do in London, there are 300 different languages spoken in London now. And how do you deal with that? Well, no individual can be competent to cover all those different cultures. But there are principles of how you deal with people from another culture, and learning about these gives you what's called cultural competence. Now, there are arguments about the best way to manage this problem. There are at least 3 different models. One model is that you have a separate service for people from a particular ethnic group that is run by people from the same ethnic group. There are a number of problems around that. First of all, it's segregation. It continues the isolation of the ethnic group. And in the end, one wants some degree of breaking down of the barriers between the majority and the minority if they're to live together harmoniously. The other problem is that it takes time for members of an ethnic group to develop a professional education. If they're coming from a culture where education is at a relatively low level, it can take 1 or 2 generations before you have people who are educated enough to run a service. So those are the particular problems of that model. Another model is to train the professionals who belong to the majority ethnic group to become culturally competent. And that can be done with courses that may run for a few days or weeks or over several months. They can be trained to be more sensitive to other cultures and also to examine their own prejudices and biases. It's very important to acknowledge very deep sometimes the feelings that we have about people who don't look like us, who have different skin colour, who have different habits. And unfortunately, often the media exploit these differences for their own political purposes. So it's all around us, and it's very hard to overcome these. It doesn't happen in a few hours. The third model is one that's been developed in Canada. And this is to have specialist people who are trained as cultural counsellors. And they come in and work with the service as a kind of intermediary between the service personnel and the people from the other cultures who are coming to meet them. Now, we don't know at this stage which is the most efficient, the best way to do this. So the whole area is in a state of flux. But I think over the next few decades we will learn the best way of doing this. And maybe there's not only one way. One of the things it's important to recognize is that consultation with a doctor, a healer, a therapist in traditional cultures is never private. In the West, we have this idea that it's a confidential encounter. You know, it's whatever is revealed to the doctor has to be kept secret between you as the client and the doctor. That does not exist in traditional cultures. Quite the contrary. The family is always there. For example, in India, hospitals usually don't provide food for the patients. The family camps outside the hospital, cooks food for the patients, brings it into the ward. They're always there for the patient. There's never this isolation between the family and the patient. And this is true even of one-off consultations. The family is there, they provide information, they listen. They're part of the social system that the patient remains embedded in. So when they come to the West, they don't expect that the doctor will see the patient on their own. They expect to be invited in and be part of the consultation. Now that may be difficult for the professionals to come to terms with. There may be 5 or 6 people coming into the clinic to be seen. On the other hand, it must be recognized as a great advantage. We know that the support that family give the mentally ill has a very strong therapeutic benefit. If you look at schizophrenia around the world and you compare the progress of people with schizophrenia in traditional societies compared to the West, it's much better. Even though there are fewer resources, people with schizophrenia in India and other traditional societies have twice as good an outcome as people in the West. And I have been involved in studies in North India, and the answer seems to be the support of the family, the ability of the family to look after someone who is quite seriously disturbed mentally. So we're in danger of losing that in the West. Very often, I often work with families, I go to see a patient who's in their 30s or 40s, who's looking after them, one elderly woman. That's the total care system, is the mother. Nobody else is there, the father's dead or disappeared. And this is an enormous burden on the single carer. But you go into a traditional family and you might find both parents, maybe even an aunt, brothers and sisters, all living in the same house. So you have a group of maybe 5, 6, 8 people who are sharing the care of the patient's needs. And this is an enormous advantage that we must not lose. But it does require a shift of mindset in the professionals to get away from the idea of confidentiality and understand that they need to share information with the whole social network. One of the things that happens with an ethnic minority group is that while they bring their tradition, their beliefs, their culture with them, the next generation, the young people who are born in the new country, are exposed to all kinds of pulls, of pressures to adapt to or even join the majority culture. It's seen as attractive in many ways. There's usually more freedom because traditional cultures have more rules and regulations. They see the material advantages, all the goods that are on display. They see other young people wearing smart clothes. So these are enormous attractions pulling them away from their own traditions. And this can be very hard because the parents often want to retain their own cultural standards, and they see the children slipping away from them into what they see as maybe an immoral, debased culture that doesn't retain their own strong values. And this can lead to a big crisis of identity for the young people. Do they belong with their parents' culture? Should they try and join the new culture that looks so attractive? And the other problem with relating to their parents is that whereas the parents' knowledge and experience in their own country would have been valued, In the new country, it has very little value. The youngsters have to learn from themselves how to adapt to the culture. The parents can't tell them. Of course, most of this adaptation takes place in the school environment, where they come into contact with many people from the new culture, new to them. Now, there are different ways of dealing with this situation. One way is for the young people to remain very traditional. And we see this in England, in Muslim groups, where the girls insist on wearing their traditional clothing, their headscarf, the long dress, and so on. And this actually can cause conflict in the school system. You know, our schools say you've got to wear the uniform everybody else wears, you can't wear your headscarves. And this has become a very hot issue politically. Now, so that's one way, is to retain your cultural values, but that then keeps you at a distance from the new culture. Another way is to become culturally competent in the new culture, but not to leave your old culture behind. And this is known as biculturalism. You can operate successfully in both cultures. And it means being able to switch from one culture to another, from one language to another, from one set of values to another. So you have to be quite a smart and adaptable person to do that. Then there are other people who want to leave their own culture behind. They disregard it, they devalue it. They try and join the new culture, but they fail. And these are the people who become marginalized. And we have done research which shows that marginalized people like that are at a higher risk for severe mental illness. So when you see someone from an ethnic minority group with a severe mental illness, one of the questions in your mind should be, has this person lost their cultural roots but not been able to join the mainstream culture? Are they actually marginalized in this way? One of the risks of developing mental illness, severe mental illness, is being marginalized from your cultural origins and not being able to gain a foothold in the new culture. There are other risk factors. Perhaps the most important is social isolation. So a person who becomes isolated from their mainstream culture, or their family or their family, loses their social networks. And we know that social isolation, not just for people from an ethnic minority, but from any group, is a risk factor for schizophrenia, for developing schizophrenia. So if you find that a person has very little contact with their family, seems to have no friends, and is out of work, because work can also provide a social support, then that person is at high risk for severe mental illness. Of course, we mustn't forget about the genetic background to severe mental illness, and having a relative with schizophrenia or manic depressive illness is itself a risk factor. So that knowledge of the family history is very important in assessing risk. If you have a parent or a sibling with severe mental illness, your chances are about 10 times as high as someone who doesn't have these relatives of developing a severe mental illness. So that's very important to know. There have been a number of studies, particularly one in Sweden recently, which showed that immigrants from any group around the world had a higher risk of developing mental illness than people born in the country from the majority ethnic group. But the risk varies according to which group you come from. If you come from the Nordic countries, the risk is slightly higher, but not massively. But if you come from much further away, in terms of the culture, the risk is much greater. So the risk seems to depend on the cultural difference between your culture and the majority culture. We find in England that the groups at highest risk are African Caribbeans from the West Indies and people from West Africa. And their risk is astonishing. For schizophrenia, it's 6 to 7 times as high as for white people born in Britain. Now, the Asian people, particularly from India, are a very interesting intermediate group because their risk is slightly higher than white British people, but nowhere near the risk that you see in African Caribbeans and Africans. So we wonder why there's this difference. And partly it seems that the Indian groups retain very strong traditional values. The family stays together, they carry on with their religious affiliations, with their food, their dress. All these things bind them together in a strong network that supports people who might be vulnerable to mental illness. Whereas often African Caribbean families are dislocated, partly because of the centuries of slavery, where the slave masters deliberately broke up families. Of course, if you look around the world at how people deal with mental illness, it varies enormously according to the westernization of the culture. So, for example, in India and Africa, where there are very few psychiatric professionals, most mentally ill people are seen by traditional healers. They act in a way like the general practitioners, and they will deal with severe mental illness. We should not dismiss what they do as witchcraft or nonsense. For example, it's well known now that an effective treatment for severe mental illness is a herb called snake root. It's a plant that grows in India and Africa, and we know from the Ayurvedic writings of the Indian traditional healers, which go back 2,000 years or more, that they advise the use of snake root for psychosis. And we also know that in Africa, although there's no written tradition, that healers have been using snake root at least for a number of generations. So long before Western biomedicine had an effective treatment for psychosis, it was there in the traditional pharmacopoeia. Far from rejecting traditional healers as nonsense, it's very important to develop a cooperative relationship with them, because people all over the world will try anything if they're ill. They don't just go to the doctor and say, do something. They will go to the local chemist, they'll go to their friends and relatives and ask for suggestions, and they may well go for traditional healing treatment. Now that was, of course, has always been true in the third world, the developing world. But increasingly in the West, people, white people, westernized people, are using traditional healing treatments. And all over the place there is an enormous flourishing of acupuncture, of aromatherapy, of all kinds of things that used to be confined to way out ideas. They're now part of mainstream culture, really, in the West. And we have to recognize that people will try anything to become well. Now, because traditional healers, even like Western doctors, are sometimes quacks, they're people who really are just in it for the money, it is useful, it's important to try and regulate what they do. And the South African government is in the process of recognizing officially traditional healers and registering them. And we are also in the similar process in the United Kingdom of achieving self-regulation of what are known as complementary and alternative medicines. So this is one way of bringing them into the health system of a Western type. But it does mean respecting what they do, even though there may not be very strong scientific evidence at this stage. Because people are using them, we need to cooperate with the alternative healers and make them part of the system. thinking about the ways in which traditional healers can be integrated into Western biomedicine, it occurs to me that when I was in India a good few years ago, I went to an Indian village to see a traditional healer there. It wasn't too far from the main city of Chandigarh in northern India. And I spoke to the healer through an interpreter who was a psychologist. And the healer, who was obviously a very intelligent man, said he could deal with almost any illness, including mental illness. But if he had a patient who was very, very depressed, that is, they weren't talking, they weren't eating, they weren't sleeping, he would realize that he couldn't deal with them, and he would then send them to the psychiatric hospital for ECT. So there was a recognition on his part that there were problems that were beyond his ability and that the Western medicine could deal with them. Now there's an interesting issue here, and that is that Western medicine has its advantages which are clearly seen in traditional cultures, particularly the control of infectious diseases. So illnesses that used to be seen as traditional, like smallpox, then get shifted over into another category, and they're seen as Western type illnesses because they can be cured by Western treatments. But mental illness is not one of the conspicuous successes of Western medicine. We're not good at healing mental illness. Most of the time what we do is to manage it, but it's still there. So it's not seen as responding well to Western medicine, and it remains categorized as a local illness, a traditional illness, and therefore the appropriate treatment is seen as the traditional healer. So almost always in these cultures, the first person that a patient will be taken to is the traditional healer. And only if that fails will they then be taken on to see the Western biomedical doctor. When we think about the ways in which many Western people present their emotional distress with depressed symptoms or anxiety or panic and so on, most general practitioners will recognize these signs of disturbance and give appropriate treatment. But for a person from a traditional culture, this is not a usual way of presenting distress. Distress is often presented in bodily symptoms. So they may well complain of pains all over the body, or weakness, or a feeling that their legs are not holding them up. And this kind of presentation is very baffling for the Western doctor because he can't find a cause for the illness, and yet the person is still distressed and complaining. Now, if that person went to a traditional healer, they're very good at picking up the fact that this is not an organic illness, and they understand the bodily symptoms as a call for help, and they interpret them as a problem in the social matrix the patient lives in, and they will prescribe a form of treatment that reintegrates the person into their social matrix and invests them with their social support. And the Western doctor doesn't understand that and will go on giving placebos or painkillers or whatever without tackling the root cause of the problem. So we have a lot to learn from traditional healers in interpreting the bodily expression of distress in people from ethnic minority groups.
Okay, we should carry on, and let me hand over to Ilaria Tariconi to introduce the next speaker. Ilaria.
Thank you very much, Robin. First, it is an honor for me to be here and to remember an unforgettable mentor, Professor Julian Leff. He taught me all that I still consider most important about caring of people with psychosis and their families. With Julian, I learned one of the most useful lessons in my life that I would like to shortly remember, which is that I still try to apply, that is positive reframing of the emotion, bearing in mind, as he told me once, whoever loves never makes mistakes. That trying to cope with my present emotion, let me introduce Dr. Juliana Onumere, senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry and Psychological Neuroscience, who took over the family work for schizophrenia from Julian. So thank you.
Has it come up? Has my screen come up?
Yes.
Lovely.
But it's not in full yes, full screen. Yep, good.
Brilliant. Welcome.
We don't see you, Juliana.
I don't want to blind you with my beauty.
No, we'll cope with it.
I'm sure I'll come up in the end.
Okay.
But welcome everybody, and thank you. I will say that this talk focuses on relatives and evidence in support of providing interventions in psychosis. And I'll correct you, Ilara. Thank you for the introduction. It's definitely my work as an extension of the work of Professor Leff, but some very key figures before me, including Elizabeth Kuipers, Professor Kuipers. But let me first start with a review of, why should we be thinking about families, and really how the work of Julian has served as a very much a powerful driver for that work. And many of you would have just heard the video or the short clip beforehand. So again, I just want to do a check-in. Have we moved to the second slide?
Yes.
Wonderful, so it's working. So if we consider carers, let's just focus a little bit as considering carers as a resource. We know that they have an absolute key role to play in facilitating recovery outcomes for people with lived experience with psychosis, and very much enhancing or optimizing outcomes and the sort of magnitude of outcomes in several different domains. And this is particularly, we find, at the onset of psychosis, when people are really unsure about what's the best thing to do and how to access help, will often be family carers that are taking a lead role in that. But work over the years has shown that just the presence and the support of families can actually enhance treatments, outcomes in other areas, including psychological therapies. But most importantly, I think for clinicians, we know that families can play an important role in identifying at a very early stage signs of relapse and difficulties, but also significantly reducing levels of relapse and hospitalisation. And we're in an era now where we focus much on economic values, and when we estimate the value of unpaid informal care, it runs into billions, whatever country that you're focusing on. Again, we just heard earlier from Julian in the video about family involvement, and we know that many people, contrary to popular ideas, that people do have families that are involved in their care and supporting them. And we can see differences actually across different countries as well, where in perhaps more traditional societies, family involvement might be more pronounced and certainly can have a positive role on outcomes. We were hearing earlier from Craig and Paola, but if we go back to that important work around ESOP and sort of following those first cases up in terms of the first episode cases and following up over 10 years, what was interesting actually in some of their work is showing that you were more likely to be alive, or certainly reduced mortality rates due to reasons of unnatural death, was far better in those groups that had family involvement from the beginning. So families seemingly having some, a positive role to play in actually people still remaining alive or still alive. But we know, many of you are clinicians on this call, or those of you with your own lived experience and caregiving experiences, but that's not the whole story. There is a large body of work, over several decades now, that highlights the negative impacts of caregiving and the role that it can have on carer health. And recent work from Jacqueline Sin and colleagues just illustrates that. You know, when we're talking about high levels of burden or a higher impact and a negative impact of care, but also significantly lower levels of positive well-being. And these are comparatively lower to what we'd expect in the general population, and in other studies also lower than what we might find in other carer groups. So we know when we're thinking about poorer carer functioning, still today, people focus on terms around burden. You know, these carers are really burdened, but actually when we focus quite specifically on what those domains are, there's a lot more research about that now. Our own work has focused on sleep disturbances in carers. You know, at least 2/3 of our psychosis carers can report significant sleep disturbances. And for many of you, again, on the webinar today, you will know what that's like if you've had one night of disturbed sleep, let alone a sort of a continued period of disturbed sleep. And this sleep is really affecting, sleep disturbances, really affecting how people might appraise their caregiving experiences, but also their resources to cope. Our carers in psychosis, including at the first episode stage, which we've put here, but it's also found in longer term groups, can and do report levels of burnout. And burnout is not dissimilar at all to what we're finding in paid healthcare practitioners. So these are carers that feel exhausted. These are carers that feel that whatever they do is not good enough, and that, you know, their coping resources are very much spent. Other areas, which I think is really interesting when we think about the work of Julian, and indeed people that have, you know, work that's followed on from that, is we often tend to think about families and carers as just one group. It must be the mother, it must be a parent. And whilst we know there are commonalities with all the different subgroups of carers, but actually we tend to miss that. And so focusing on the specific needs of spousal carers or partner carers, when particularly there may be issues around intimacy. If we think about siblings, not only do siblings might have issues about, you know, will I become poorly myself? Will I have to take on the caregiving role? But work here from Sian Bowman and colleagues finding that siblings were particularly perturbed and particularly affected when there were issues around suicidality and violence in the relationship. Some really nice work just focusing on specifically parents. And we know that parents and certainly caregivers in psychosis can report higher levels of burden, high levels of psychological disturbance, high levels of difficulties compared to the general population, and indeed other carers from other conditions. And this work very much illustrates that as well. So it brings me to, I guess, one of the most important bits of work in relation to family work from Julian in one of his most widely co-authored cited papers with Christine Vaughan, which for many of you would know extended the work of George Brown and colleagues to develop an abbreviated version of the, you know, the gold standard Campbell family interview, which provides a more sort of quantifiable tool of measuring family relationships and dynamics. And most importantly, again, the thing that often gets missed, of being able to identify areas of needs and strengths. And when I was looking yesterday in PubMed, I mean, this is a paper that's been cited over 1,500 times. And it was this original programme of work around expressed emotion, and in terms of how we can measure it in a more timely fashion, that very much underpinned the meta-analytic and aggregate reviews that we've seen that confirm significantly higher relapse rates in service users from high EE households compared to those living in low EE households. And again, for most of you that work in this area, these will often be key papers that we go back to, very much building on the work of before in terms of Julian and George Brown and colleagues. But the work there, it hasn't just stopped. When we think around expressed emotion and its predictive links, certainly high levels, its predictive links with poorer outcomes, there's one sort of consistent story that seems to come out of that, is the importance around criticism and critical comments. So even when we are looking at, service users who've been exposed to or living in high E households, and where there's very much high levels of criticism, we can still predict over several years poorer outcomes. And so there seems to be something incredibly important about the family atmosphere and people's exposure to more negative and difficult family relationships, and indeed its impact on service user outcomes. Much of the work, often when we're doing teaching, you would pose a question, how does high levels of expressed emotion, how does that lead to this high levels of relapse and high levels of hospitalization? And people, there's something that happens in the middle, but we're not so sure. Well, actually, we're becoming much more confident about what the mechanisms are. And it does tend to focus on, impacting on emotional well-being of service users, which then itself can precipitate more psychosis, relapses. And we see that also in at-risk groups. So people who are exposed to more critical type of relationships can be very sensitive to that and find that hard to recover from without the right support. Included this paper from Hess because I think it's a wonderful, to go back to what you were saying earlier, Robin, about the whole reason you kind of combined your work with Julian. This is a really good example of the importance of why we need to intervene both individually but also within the systems in which service users find themselves living with. So we know that when you're exposed to and living in difficult family atmosphere, it can not only just impact on your overall outcomes, but can certainly have an impact on how you as the service user think about yourself. And with often people getting stuck or finding themselves stuck in a vicious cycle. And at any one point, it'd be really important to think about how we intervene. So if we're thinking about the service user, we should definitely always be thinking about the family or the system that they're part of. I want to just end a little bit part of this talk is what often gets missed, in which, some of the earlier work from Julian and indeed others really kind of highlighted, was also the importance of warmth. That's also part of the expressed emotion, the importance of warmth, being able to develop and generate and facilitate those pro-social exchanges within families. And it's an area that doesn't get as much attention, yet it's the important part of the family dynamics that Julian and colleagues have also spoken about. So it's been this body of work, certainly in expressed emotion studies, but also supplemented by other investigations, just looking at how we might think, how carers might think about the illness and how they might be impacted by the illness, that has really kind of driven our focus on models and developing specific models around caregiving responses in psychosis. So we want to focus, when we're thinking around caregivers and families actually in psychosis, really seeing that it's something separate or independent and focusing on the initial relationship and understanding that a carer's appraisal of the service user's behaviour is something different and can be different from the appraisal of the illness, but both together combined can have a significant impact on how they present in terms of how the carer presents and their emotional reactivity and experiences, which then also impacts on how they relate and interact with services and the service user. So again, it provides a very clear map in terms of why and how and where we might want to intervene. Julian, in terms of his work and identifying the needs of families, was very clear about support and interventions. And indeed, that is very much shaped a lot of the work that we'll go on to talk about. There are many of you that are joining us here today from, all over the world, which is lovely. But we know that working with families and certainly supporting family systems affected by and supporting relatives with psychosis is promoted by several clinical guidelines and best practice guidelines across the globe. And I've not put all of them down here, but we know both in the UK and different parts of Europe and Australia, Asia and Canada and America, some inclusion around psychosocial approaches and specifically working with families is included. And certainly for us in the UK, even at different phases of the illness experience, there is a focus and a commitment to working and supporting families. Some of the key objectives of family intervention, certainly the evidence-based ones, because we're very good at talking about it, but what are the key bits? We know that the really key bits is about helping families to understand and make sense of the experiences around psychosis and indeed its impact, its unique impact on themselves, but also on their family unit and their relationships. As the nod to the positivity and the pro-social aspect, it's about trying to improve and increase those positive interactions, as we know that people can do better with positive interactions, even in the context of more difficult exchanges. If we can increase the warmth, that can be incredibly important in terms of reducing levels of relapse. And much of the other key objectives around family interventions can involve the cognitive reappraisal, helping people to understand and think about the problems they're facing in a different way, and a real focus on problem solving and emotional management. But most importantly, across all of the family interventions, and there will be many of you again who are engaged in your own family interventions, we know that they can differ in terms of how they're delivered, how long they're how long they're provided. But one of the really key objectives is about preventing relapse and building on the strengths of families. So here I come to my little photo album the female in your picture here is Professor Elizabeth Kuipers. We have Professor Julian Leff and indeed Professor Dominic Lamb. And you may ask, why do I put their pictures down? I put their pictures down because it's these three people that have been involved in manualising our evidence-based family interventions. And some of the early editions, the green ones are the 1992 and the 2002 second edition. So this is really integrating all of the work, all of the learning, all of the evidence about what works for families and what might be helpful in terms of supporting them in their well-being, was placed into manuals, and with some advanced work from Julian himself. I mean, it dates back several decades now, or many decades, of just really different studies and meta-analytic reviews that support both the efficacy and indeed the effectiveness of intervening with families with psychological interventions. And in many of them are very much focused. If you're having to summarize these studies, family interventions seem to work best on leading to significant reductions in levels of relapse, hospitalization, and certainly in high EE households, reducing those levels. But also actually an area that often gets missed when we're thinking around family interventions is its improvements, its ability to improve social functioning in service users, because often in sessions people will be doing more. Some recent work that we've conducted, just focusing even at the early psychosis stage, finding again just very much confirming the direction of travel in terms of those results, that family interventions can be significantly lead to significant reductions in relapse and high levels of EE, but also really impacting on service user functioning. And interestingly, again, when people weren't necessarily recording those outcomes in their own right, we also know that it can have a positive impact on reducing levels of carer burden and improving well-being, which we know can be significantly lower in our carers and psychosis carers. Similar work here in terms of just with 24-month follow-up, just finding that family interventions again can reduce relapse, but also not just compared to treatment as usual, but also other psychosocial interventions, which again is really important in terms of trying to determine or add value to the uniqueness of the interventions. Some longer term follow-up data comes from colleagues over in China, who followed up people over the sort of 14 years, and again confirmed much more improved social functioning as indicated by those service users that had received family interventions tended to be in more work, or certainly have more workability, which again speaks to the importance for us anyway in terms of being able to give families and indeed service users the chance to engage in this type of work. But in terms of the key questions that I wanted to kind of share today is comparatively, we still know very little about what people make of family interventions. You can speak to clinicians, yes, it would be really good, be good to help families be more supported, but what do we know about what families say? So we do know it's really nice work from Rory Bryan and colleagues who, is a nice sort of myth buster for many people that actually family members would like actually different interventions, both pharmacologically and psychologically. But they understood that it worked in different ways and, would have concerns for both. But they would want those things. They want those interventions. It's not an either or. So some early work has focused on some of the positive or just what, how people have found family interventions to benefit them. So some recent work, which I thought was really nice just to share, was showing that, for both service users and patients and family members, people have talked about family work helping in terms of developing a better understanding and indeed a better acknowledgement and acceptance of some of the difficulties they're facing. The recognition of early indicators of problems, the warning signs, but also helping families, I'm going to talk about families and service users within that, to help them communicate and better with each other and within the family system. And again, just mapping onto the key objectives around family interventions. People have talked about it helping with their own problem solving approaches and helping to support more independence. And that's what we've got from both service users and carers. Key questions though, we've got several years of work confirming that family interventions can be helpful and very much focused around relapse and reducing hospitalisation, more recently now focusing on the sort of carer outcomes, but not very clear at this stage in terms of how it works. It's good that it works, but in what way? What are the mechanisms? Some early indicators suggest that it might work through promoting and facilitating greater empathy amongst family members and, a bit more distance, I guess, in terms of how they're approaching problems. But we don't know. We can't definitively say it works like this for this reason in terms of what's been confirmed from research. So one to watch out for, to look out for, is a recently published protocol from Alina Lewiski and Tanya Lincoln, who are going to, focus on a network meta-analysis, which should provide a much better understanding of the different types of family interventions that are out there and what works for whom and what do we need, what's the sort of optimal sessions, are we comparing like with like? And these are really important questions to ask because we've reached that stage. But again, I take you back to the recording that you listened to over the break. We should be supporting people. We should be trying to help families. But the real question, the real issue that continues is equitable access to family interventions across geographical regions, across different countries, across demographic groups. If you're lucky enough to live next to fantastic services and indeed education institutions, yes, you might be more likely to receive family interventions and indeed from trained clinicians, but the further afield that you live or that you're part of, you might not. Some recent work from a group in America really illustrates this, I think, very clearly in terms of unmet need with certain groups. So when they were focused on first episode families and service users, just finding that actually symptom-wise, symptom load, clinical presentations, that was far more pronounced in Black participants, but yet they were also the group less likely to be in receipt and certainly being able to access family interventions or family approaches. I focus on deliberately, actually intentionally focused on the Black participants there from the American work, because I think, again, we heard from Julian talking about issues in relation to stigma and migration status. So when we think about, that certainly in the UK and the different groups that we work with, who might have very, able to have very different ideas or dual ideas or parallel ideas about how they might conceptualize psychosis, and indeed how they might think about treatments, and indeed what they think might be helpful. And we know that even just what we might understand has caused their problems might differ between different racial and minority ethnic groups. So if we go back to the important work around expressed emotion, more recent work, and it's been steadily going along over the years, just showing that there isn't one necessarily normative experience as we relate to EE. So when we look at EE, but with a more racial and cultural lens, you have a greater appreciation of how the experience of EE-related behaviours, particularly in relation to criticism or particularly in relation to warmth, and indeed the predictive outcomes from those key areas can differ along racial and ethnic lines. And that's very important for us in terms of the work that we continue to do in this area. Some really nice work as a way to sort of illustrate the more sort of global approach that takes into account different racial and ethnic groups when we're thinking about working with families is a recent review from Elsewhere that just focused on, the role of family interventions in Arab-speaking nations, and very few studies, but of the studies that are there, it does indicate that we can, it will be okay. It can be implemented. There will be, there's a possibility, and people might take this up. And this is the area, this is certainly the area of work that we want to focus on in terms of globalizing and understanding what changes might need to be made to work with other groups that have generally been underrepresented in our studies. Some work just going on in the UK from Dawn Edge and colleagues, but looking at sort of culturally adapted family interventions for African-based and Caribbean groups in the UK. Again, more to be learned about what adaptations are required or needed and how people find that. And that's really extending the family work. I want to end the talk just focusing on some of the other innovations that are very much come out of the earlier work from Julian and colleagues, which is around digital interventions. Particularly in the last year, if we think about what COVID has done to how we work and what we're able to deliver, the role that digital interventions can play in working with families. We're much more familiar with talking about that in terms of service users and other groups, but in terms of with families, and certainly families of those affected by mental health, it's definitely a growing area. Some work from Fiona Lobbin and colleagues who just relatively recently completed a large-scale trial looking at family support using digital methods, and finding equal benefit to the treatment as usual and the comparator intervention. But the question about whether we can, and does digital interventions or digital platforms have a role in supporting our families affected by psychosis, does seem to be answered in a much more positive way. Some work that we've done here in KCL, and indeed certainly with the benefit of many colleagues on the line today, has focused just particularly on supporting families themselves and carers independently to address some of their needs. And these are carers from across the globe. So we developed a massive open online course which was designed really as it's a free to access course, but it's designed really to kind of support our understanding, to support people's understanding of psychosis and its various impacts. As Julian mentioned again in the recording, many of our families can often find themselves in a very isolating or isolative position, where it's very hard to talk with others about their experiences, and particularly if you also then find yourself as part of a particular group, a racial group or an ethnic minority group, where those conversations might be more layered for a variety of reasons. So this is a global platform that allowed, you know, people in whatever country you were in, as long as you had internet access, to connect with each other, but also to understand and have, you know, facilitated learning around what psychosis is and its different impacts. And to date, we've had, you know, we're fortunate to have learners from all over the globe and all the different continents. Final piece of work, you know, many of you might, you know, some of you will often ask the question, but, you know, but what of those service users? We're often working with people that don't want family interventions for a variety of reasons, and we don't expect everybody does. But they're still living with their families. They're still in those households that are really struggling for a variety of reasons, but particularly about their communications, which we know can have a negative impact on their outcomes. There's some novel work undertaken by some colleagues as well, including myself and Elizabeth Kuipers, just focused on a very brief intervention, a sort of pilot intervention. It was 3 sessions just to work with service users who their primary reason in terms of presenting was a difficult relationship, interpersonal relationship with their carer. And really what we used were the key components of the full evidence-based family interventions, which is very much around cognitive reappraisal, you know, positive reframing, and very much focusing on self-esteem enhancing strategies. So really, how can we try to adapt what we would do with larger families or the families in full to a much more briefer version and just with the service user? And so these are early days, so it'd be really good to kind of see how that develops with the much bigger study. Just want to end with the acknowledgements to Professor Elizabeth Kuipers, who I, you know, as many of you know, would have worked incredibly closely with Julian. And I found this photo. I didn't take it from you, but I found this photo. So for those of you, let's just see if this works. I've tried doing this laser pointer. So we've got Julian here, we have Dominic here, and we have Elizabeth here, and amongst many others that I know that they'll be familiar with. And I end in terms of, you know, it's a great pleasure to celebrate the work and indeed the life of Julian Leff as well. They're really important to kind of keep the focus on the needs of our families. And then now.
So thank you very much indeed. That was very interesting indeed, Juliana. We've got a few questions. And this one takes me back to in the 70s and 80s, where some psychiatrists thought the main thing to do was to separate patients from their relatives. So this is a question from somebody who's anonymous, but saying, I read in a psychiatry book that family members should not spend too much time with the person with schizophrenia who's unwell. Do you agree with this?
I agree in terms of, I don't think anyone should spend a lot of time with anybody, if for the sake of anyone's relationship. I think it is important. I think that's often taken out of context. And so when you're in clinical settings, people will often get to the point of they should just be separated. That's very unhelpful, both for the families and indeed the service user. I think what people are trying to highlight is actually it's always good to have independence. It's always good to have independent skills. When you live, you know, particularly for families that live in multi-generational households, you can still have independent skills that can be supported in services as opposed to just being separated. But I think when you have the experience of psychosis and the way it might affect people, just spending extended amounts of time with anyone without having something separate is not necessarily always that helpful.
Is it fair to say, Juliana, that, I mean, one thing we've learned from the genetics is that psychosis is polygenic, and that the relatives of people with schizophrenia, on average, have a higher polygenic risk score for schizophrenia as well. So there'll be some of the people that you're doing your therapy with who will have a bit of a loading for schizophrenia and may have minor psychotic symptoms themselves. How do you deal with this?
But I think it's not uncommon, actually. And I think for those that, again, working clinically and certainly working with families, I'm yet to work with a family member or relative who's not affected in some ways, whether that's with, you know, standard mood disorder or anything in between. I think the key bit, and for many families, you often can, till this day, can often find yourself feeling incredibly guilty about what you've done or what you think you've done. Either it relates to yourself or the family of origin from yourselves. And I think the key question should be what support we are trying to give people at a time when they need it.
Another question is from Olodokun Olyayinka, who says, as a trainee in 1988, my Oxford textbook of psychiatry, it's good, you feel free to abuse the Oxford textbook, that's all right. I mentioned words like woolly speech, double-blind, schizophrenic mothers in the context of communication styles impacting on children growing up in homes where the mothers themselves are schizophrenic. Are these concepts still considered in family interactions, possibly under expressed emotions?
No. And I do, again, I work with many colleagues, you know, where that traditionally was felt to be the main message, and more recent and updated teaching is not like that. There's still a number of myths that go around families, and I think that's why it's incredibly important, as I'm speaking to the converted here, that people are educating themselves, and most importantly also educating families, because these are things that people can go online and get that information, and they think, you know, is it me? Surely it's me, it's the way I'm talking, it's the way that we've brought my son up, that's why we've got those problems. So we do all have a role in terms of being able to, I guess, bust those myths. But that's we work from the premise, and certainly the work of Julian and Elizabeth and many, is that families are coming with strengths. That it's not the ill family. They will have difficulties just like other families, but the pathology isn't within the family.
Yeah, here's another interesting one from Paula Conneely. Do you struggle unpicking specific outcomes from family interventions when the term covers such a huge range of interventions? Single family, multifamily, relatives group, educational and skills-based.
Yeah, and I think what's really important when we start to look at, you know, if you kind of think many of the good guidelines have kind of done reviews of that anyway, but as I mentioned before, the network analysis would be really helpful, providing a bit more of a summary around that. For the psychoeducational interventions, we know that they can happen with just an individual family. We know that they can happen in multiple families. We know that they can happen with the service user included, the service user included for some sessions, or indeed not at all. So it can vary in many ways, but still the direction of travel is that and the main results are that it can be really important and effective in reducing relapse.
Now, there are these quite fashionable ways of measuring the mood of patients and also sometimes their physiology from moment to moment. Have people done this in relation to so-called high expressed emotion relatives, that are there some relatives or some mums where you would be encouraging contact with the patient, and other mums where you can see that on the patient's ratings that this makes them feel worse?
Yeah, some of the earlier work, I'm not sure why it lost its people lost interest, because it's a really interesting paradigm where people were, it's very much focused to when service users are exposed to more difficult communications, was actually doing more sort of physiological ratings with service users and finding how, heart activation and, those types of measures, and how people can be affected by different types of communication. And that kind of stopped, which is a shame, really. It was certainly an area when I was reading about it, I was really interested in, and, I think the area is there to be picked up on.
Yeah. And here's one from Brian Martindale, who raises the question, would you agree that a major problem in the mental health field is that nearly all training is with individuals? And I guess that many of us lack confidence in engaging with families.
I think that's true. I think it's trying to change. I think it's an important area. And I think, we're very, as you said, it's super confident in working with one person. And then certainly, but this does focus, I think it's, this does seem to be specific to working age adults. So for those of you that are working with children, or indeed working with older adults, we're much more comfortable, we're much more familiar with having more than one person in. It's the norm. It's the moment we hit the sort of traditional 18 plus Western type interventions, that's when we focused on the single person. But it would be unfair to say that that's not, people aren't trying, because they are. I definitely see pockets of good practice in many services.
Are you familiar with the open dialogue method from Finland, Juliana? Are there some overlaps with family interventions?
Yeah, I think there is, insofar as the importance and recognising the need of working with networks. If you speak to, and I know there's obviously the Razak's big trial that's going on in the UK about that. I think the idea of placing the service user at the centre of a network is really important, and you see that in family interventions. The importance around communication, the importance of working with different groups, definitely. In terms of how that might work, in terms of if we think just certainly in the UK, in terms of traditional family interventions, where sometimes one of the reasons why we struggle to get people to be seen, because it can be a struggle to get different staff together at the same time. So it'd be nice to kind of see how that works as part of the open dialogue, and getting more than one person from different geographical areas together.
So a note from Eleanor Cole, such an informative and clearly presented presentation. Many carers are our community care. So lots of warmth from Eleanor, and also from a number of other people complimenting you on how informative this presentation has been. Then one by from Desaraigne, earlier work by George Brown suggested there was an improvement when the mother went out, but overall relapse rate was higher in patients living in hostels than with parents, I think.
Yeah, I wonder, but if we kind of think about how different research has come on board, and what we've learned about being isolated, and what we've learned about people who, just the relationship between isolation and symptoms and people's experiences. People need relationships, even in little amounts, and positive ones. And those, as we know, living with psychosis, who might be complicated by a whole range of difficulties, it's easy to be isolated.
Okay, I think we're out of time, Juliana. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and covering the early years when Julian and Christine Vaughan started this kind of work, through the work by Elizabeth Kuipers and others up to the present day. So many thanks. And now we go on to Ilaria. Would you like to unmute yourself and introduce our final speaker?
Yes, thank you. Isma is one of the most prominent and influential psychiatrists in our time, in our generation, a man who has left his mark on this age in the field of community psychiatry, stigma, and epidemiological psychiatry. A former director of the World Health Organization Division of Mental Health and a former president of the World Psychiatric Association, as well as of the European Psychiatric Association. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Norman Sartorius.
Thank you very much. I really feel privileged for being invited to come to this session. Because Julian was a friend of many years, we met first in the 1960s of the last century, and then spent years together in the 1970s, where we worked together on the schizophrenia studies, the expressed emotion early work, which started in that framework. And since then, I think I had many occasions to work together and to travel together and to laugh together, and also, I think, to be inspired. He had one shortcoming, which is that he played chess better than I, and I used to lose when he was playing with me. But sometimes he let me win, and so that was a great step forward. I have one specific aspect of our friendship was that he was a friend with whom I never had any disagreement. We, in fact, agreed on most things that we were talking about, and we were also able to think together about things in a constructive way. And the reason for my selecting to speak about the future of psychiatry has been, to a large extent, that we have often spoken about that and thought, where is psychiatry going, and what kind of a psychiatry will there be tomorrow, and in what way will it develop itself? So I will try to share the screen and speak about the future of psychiatry. So sorry, you have to do this here. No, this is not the one I wanted. Excuse me for this interruption. I'm trying to do my best.
Oh, don't worry, Norman. Everybody always enjoys when this happens, because we
thank you so much.
All of us.
Well, I wanted to start with saying that in the fighting for mental health and about thinking about the future for mental health, we have in the recent years been very happy to have won several important battles. First, the United Nations have for the first time recognized that mental health means something. In fact, it has been included into the Sustainable Development Goals. The Secretary General of the United Nations decided of all diseases and all states to speak about mental health. There has been for the first time an inclusion of mental health into the priority plans. So that is certainly a politically an enormous step forward from what it used to be. I think the treatment technology which we are having is much better now than it ever was before. We have become aware of the importance of stigma and the ways how to do it. And if you look at the programs, some of the programs that have been done to deal with stigma, for example, the one in Canada, the one in Britain, in Denmark, in Australia, in many other countries, they have been producing results. And in our program on stigma, which we have done in 23 countries, both developed and developing, rich and poor, it has been quite clear that there is no country in which you cannot achieve a progress if you want to fight against stigma. I think we've also trained a huge number of psychiatrists over time, although they are still insufficient in numbers, people say, but I think that we are now in an incomparably better situation. There are now some 270,000 psychiatrists roaming about in the world. And even in the countries which are poor or of low income, the number of psychiatrists has increased very significantly in the last few years. I think in addition to this, we have seen that in a number of countries, the patients and family organizations have come into appearance. In some countries, they have been politically undesirable, for example, in China and in some other countries. But in many other countries, they have come and they started to participate, and psychiatrists have found it also useful to speak and to work with them and to think of treatment and other services together with patient organizations or family organizations. The World Health Organization has decided that to do a very significant part of its program on mental health deal with human rights, which was a great step forward. And even the Commissioner for Human Rights has been very concerned with thinking about ways in which human rights of people with mental illness can be improved, can be more evenly respected and fulfilled. We have seen much of the work that has been done on research. The increase of the funding given for research over the last 60 years has been enormous, and I think that it's still not enough, but it's been a great step forward. But despite of this, it's only still many things which we need to continue worrying about. There is only a very small proportion of the people who are suffering from mental illness who get treatment. The estimates are that approximately 80 to 85% of all people in the low and middle income countries are not having access to treatment, nor do they get it. Some of them rely on the traditional healers, but the curious state of governments in many places, which has been against the traditional healers, has even removed the traditional healers from the helping group that has been there. The protection of human rights is also not very complete. In many countries, we are seeing that if you go and explore, you see that although on paper and speaking, they say, yes, we are doing something very significant to improve and to protect human rights. Basically, there's still a lot to be done. And I think it's a lot to be done on all sorts of levels to protect human rights. And stigma, well, these programs I mentioned a minute ago are still large programs, but these programs are separate from the mental health service and from the health service in general. It would be of great importance to include the anti-stigma activities into the daily work and not keep it as a separate program with campaigns every so often. So maybe we should succeed in convincing people of the world that that is what should be done. And then the education about mental health in medical schools and everywhere has mainly been concerned with mental illness and not with mental health, which I think we have to work further to do something about that. The laws of concerning mental health have also been outdated, but still maintained. And some of them are just simple copies of laws, for example, in France or in England or somewhere else, which have been copied and used, and they are just a piece of paper on which things are written, but not much more. And I mentioned that the research funds have grown up enormously, but they're still far from being commensurate with the importance of the subject and with the promise that such research might have. And even the organizations that have been bringing together people with mental illness and their carers, they're not particularly well supported. And the problem is, of course, that they're usually run by 1, 2, or 3 or 5 people who are very energetic and want to do it. But when they are themselves bogged down by problems of their own or problems of their family, they stop worrying about it, and the associations lapse into a period of inactivity, which is not very, making them very strong and influential. The huge epidemic of alcohol and drug abuse is still on the rise. The COVID pandemic, which was recently happening, one of the most stable indicators of COVID's impact has been, in fact, the increased use of alcohol and drug abuse everywhere where this has been measured. But even without COVID, instead of getting significant steps forward, we still see that most of those problems are enormous and growing. And as our technology advances, we are producing more and more powerful drugs. And the catastrophe of fentanyl that has recently been described is a good example of that. And then also the promotion of mental health has not been given very much attention anymore. It has been promoted for a while, mainly by words, not by action, and that has not been very helpful. But then there are some new developments which are very important. of them is what has been called the commoditification of medicine. The word has been invented by an Australian colleague, I think, and it has been basically used worldwide now. It is basically saying that everything in society is a commodity and has to be treated as a commodity. So that health is also a commodity, and therefore you should only invest into health if you can demonstrate that it is paying off. And therefore, I should think about specifically what are we getting in terms of actual product for anything that we do in mental health. This has been accompanied by unbelievable increase in private health care and a decrease of care to people who cannot pay for it. And also a decrease of care where the evidence of subsequent economic gain from the treatment has been rather feeble, like it was in the field of mental health. And that, I think, the commoditification is getting worse and worse. The problem is, of course, that we are seeing this enormously advanced facilities and systems of private healthcare that have grown up also in developing countries of different descriptions, with a neglect and a significant decrease of resources that are put into the public health and public mental health. The digitalization of medicine has, of course, provided us with marvelous new tools of telemedicine and understanding and at-distance treatment, etc. But it has also contributed, to an extent at least, to a dehumanization of medicine. And the problem is that we are in a position where very soon we will in fact become servants of the digital system rather than the masters. And I think that the position of using internet and other tools in order to promote what we need to do is a very different proposition from being used by it and gradually becoming slaves of the system rather than being its masters. Urbanization has been mentioned earlier, and it's not as the towns that we mentioned are maybe not as striking as some others. The fact that, for example, today in Argentina, 95% of the population lives in towns, and that not only do they live in towns, but they have moved in towns within the last 25 years, means that the ideas that we can think about community care have become obsolete. It is not possible anymore to speak of community care in a setting in which communities do not exist. People who live in these towns, they do not know each other, or if they do know each other, it is very often they don't maintain, and they're certainly not helping one another or willing to function as the traditional sense of the community of people who know each other, who have common interests, who want to build something together. And the notion of a community care in an urban setting is a different proposition, and we have to reinvent this if you want to. Other things have now come into operation and gradually are growing within the urban settings, but that is certainly not enough. And the anomie, which Durkheim has described very many years ago, is now dominantly present in all interviews that we have with people. A number of single-person households in towns have grown over the last 20 years from approximately 15 to 40%. A huge number of single-person households in which there is nobody who can help people with mental illness. And equally so, the changes of the family, both the change of the family in the sense of it becoming smaller, but also the change of the family in terms of the responsibility that families take for one another. In previous times, it was quite normal that children look after their parents. And that was particularly true and the pride of people who lived in the developing world. But that has changed. And children refuse to look after their parents. So that in fact, a country like in Bangladesh, a special law had to be put through in order to punish children who do not look after their parents, who become aged and who cannot look after themselves any longer. And a similar is true in China and in a number of other countries. And that change has been of significance, particularly in the field of psychiatry, where people feel that they should not be taking on responsibility for others, be it their parents or partners or children or friends. And then, of course, there is a demographic change worldwide, which brings for us very important things, such as, for example, a quadrupling of the comorbidity of mental and physical illness that is in part due to the fact that we have prolonged life, but we have not made it a disease-free life. We have now disease-free periods which are exactly the same as they were 20 years ago. So that we have now an extension of life, significant, but not an extension of disease-free life. And then there are also the other changes of the variety of members of the society, the changing role of women, which have previously carried the burden, the many burdens of looking after children, transmitting culture, looking after the elderly, looking after the community, building social networks. All of this is remaining on their shoulders. But in addition, they also have to go out to work. And together, all this represents an enormous burden. I think there are also some other new developments which are important. I think that gradually we understand that from early on, maybe from childhood, one should think about self-help, teaching people self-help for many problems. For example, the problem-solving skills, which are currently considered as a property or as a proper technique that should be used by doctors when meeting problems, or by psychologists when people have problems, teaching them, they should be taught in primary school. They should be taught early in school, because this self-help as such not only returns confidence to people, but in addition reduces the burden on health services, which can then pay more attention to things that people cannot do themselves. We have also still the electronic information is changing the doctor-patient relationship. There's a wonderful example that we had recently in which we were asking people to tell us how often they have consulted computers to see what their health, what their disease is, and found that while in a country like in which we did this, like in the Czech Republic, there was a very small number of people who looked at the internet to find out about the disease, while in a country like Turkey, the number was very high. Very surprising finding, in part perhaps explicable with the confidence that people have in the judgment of their doctors. But we do not know how much people are learning and to what an extent the learning by themselves about their illness changes the doctor-patient relationship, and above all also the impact that the advice that the doctor gives to patients might have. And then there is also the question of the promotion of mental health. It is usually thought that the promotion of mental health is to reduce the number of people who have mental health problems. Or sometimes promotion of mental health is seen as being an enhancement of mental capacities, especially able to think twice as fast. But in fact, the most important meaning of the word promotion is that the value that people give to their own mental health and the mental health of others is placed higher on the scale of values of individuals and societies. Because once mental health is high on the scale of values, everything else will fall into place. People will then find themselves, in fact, driven by their own motivation to do things for their own mental health, for other people's mental health, and to think of ways in which they can preserve it and improve it. Another area which I think is of great importance is the primary prevention of mental and neurological disorders. Take the example of correction of mild sensory deficits. We now have approximately between 40 and 60 million children who are dropouts from schools in Latin America. And most of them, in fact, have dropped out because of either of parental disregard or much more frequently than we expect because of mild sensory deficits, which make them unable to follow class. They become, because of it, they fail and they become dropouts. And the same is true for mild hearing deficits, where a child which is not tested for hearing deficit, very often considered stupid, irresponsive, disobedient, and because of that has a career that is very likely leading them to become dropouts, to get into the street and to remain as street children, using drugs and going into a very bad situation. And there are millions of them around. What does it cost to correct a mild sensory deficit, for example, hypermetropia? Less than a bottle of Coca-Cola. And I think that that is a notion that we as psychiatrists must not leave to others, because it's for us to tell people that drug dependence can be prevented in various ways. For example, by thinking about correction of sensory deficit in children. Equally so, the perinatal care. In a number of perinatal care facilities which we have looked at, there is no notion or thought about providing iodine to women who are in pregnancy, preventing cretinism. And so between 4 and 6 million children are born as cretins for nothing, where it would be perfectly possible to correct it. And a number of similar things, problem-solving skills of mothers, which could be taught in the course of perinatal care, which is truly a priority in many ways for healthcare, but not seen as such, is something that you should be doing. And then there are, in India alone, approximately 150 million children who are stunted. It's a huge number. And many of the causes that have been responsible for stunting are difficult to correct, like poverty. But there are others which could be corrected by additional stimulation and by various ways that society could take to prevent stunting, which is opening the door to a variety of latent problems and disorders. And I mentioned already the management of comorbidity of mental and physical illness is a huge problem that stands before us. We are now saying and knowing that up to 58% of all people with mental disorder will also have a physical illness. Their life will be shortened for about 15, 20 years. But equally so that about 30% of all people with physical illness have a mental illness, in both instances, not corrected. We've just completed a study in which we examined 3,000 people with diabetes to see how many of them have the depression. And we found, as one would expect from other studies, approximately 10% of the people with diabetes have also depressive disorder. And as also in other studies, that is about twice as much as people who do not have diabetes. But what was tragic to see that even in the highly developed countries, only 2 to 5% of those who had depression were recognized as such by their doctors. And we know that the consequences of the presence of depression in diabetes is a vast increase in complications and vast increase in the state of diabetes itself, as well as a variety of other problems that might arise in a person who is not only depressed, but also who is not only diabetic, but also depressed. I think that there's also other things which we have to remember. One is the tremendous importance of the non-specific aspects of treatment on the living together. And I think that the work that Jerome Frank and others have done earlier, demonstrating that if you have a treated disease, which is treated with medications, that one can think about 30% of that effect of treatment will be due to the drug, and 30% will be due to a placebo effect, and 30% will be due to what he has called at the time non-specific aspects of treatment. The way in which one shows respect to the patient, and the way in which one creates a relationship, develops a plan jointly to develop activities that will maybe be helpful, and 100 other things that go into that general thing, which are practically absent from any checklist that exists. A very striking example of that is the little booklet that has just recently come out in the United States, and it is called The Rabbit Effect. And I mean, it's a silly little book, but it's an important thing because it describes the notion that in a very large laboratory, there were experiments which were made with rabbits, giving them a very bad diet, which was causing them to have heart failure. And all of these rabbits were behaving properly. They got their heart failure, except for a small group, which did not get heart failure or heart disease as frequently. And the only explanation was that since there were several laboratory assistants who were looking after the rabbits, There was one laboratory assistant who liked rabbits, spoke to them, occasionally played with them, paid some attention to them, and they didn't die as much. Now, that's a rabbit. How much more important and true is this for humans, where in disease or in distress or under the impact of huge numbers of risk factors in human relation that is established and the care for others would be of tremendous importance. And that is, of course, true for healthcare as well. And not only for healthcare, but also for the education of people who should think that this non-specific aspect of treatment are within the might of people who are not trained in medicine and who can help others to a very significant degree by providing them what has been called the rabbit effect. Another area that is, I think, of great importance is to think of how we can make both doctors and patients and carers more in the possession of communication skills, skills of listening, skills of convincing others, of negotiation, leadership skills. I mean, these are skills which are enormously important, yet normal training in all schools of medicine is not including them. We have had a great pleasure over the years to carry out a number of leadership training courses with young colleagues, young psychiatrists, who I think have been learning these skills while they were with us. And I think it did help them a great deal in their work, according to what they're telling us. But one thing that was certain was that none of them had received any training in them while at home in their own school. And I think it's such a basic skill which belongs to us, particularly if you're a psychiatrist and you don't have it. How to listen to people is such an important thing, and yet so neglected in teaching. We shall, in order to achieve this, have to revise our education about mental health and illness, not only to change the content by adding both knowledge and skills relevant to the tasks of the future, but also changing where we produce education. It is silly to talk about anxiety in people with cardiovascular illness in the Department of Psychiatry. It should be done in the Department of Cardiology. It is silly to think of that we can somehow teach outside of the context in which the action will take place. We have also seen that changing the person who gives the training changes the amount that people accept. This was particularly true for general practitioners. When they were trained by psychiatrists, they were in fact learning extremely little, and the change of their behavior was almost zero. When they were trained by other general practitioners who knew something about mental health, they listened very carefully, because this was one of theirs who knows how to do it and who is aware of their problems, and therefore they listened. And the change in practice subsequently was vast. So we should think, who are the best teachers for different things? Who is the right person to teach? Is it true, as it was shown in Uganda 50 years ago, 70 years ago, that the mothers of children who are mentally retarded are the best teachers to other mothers who also have retarded children? Or should there be somebody else who should be doing this? And I think that's kind of a question of who are the teachers is of great importance. And then, of course, we should also change the manner of our evaluation of who may go into which discipline, who is suitable to become a psychiatrist and who is not. Because it's not just a wish to be a psychiatrist. It also requires not only training, but also a certain type of personality, which makes people successful and useful. Now, I think that in all, not being depressed in any way, I think the future of psychiatry and mental health science is bright. And I think that if we invest sufficiently into its utilization of its potential, we'll make people happier, we'll make ourselves happier, and make societies happier. And I think in the process of doing this on behalf of psychiatry, we can maybe also hope to return some of the soul of medicine, which has been damaged and we are in danger of losing. I thank you again for inviting me. And I want to say that of these topics that I mentioned, a number of them Julian and I have been talking about. And I remember that as well as many other things. And I thank you for letting me speak at this commemoration.
Thank you very much indeed, Norman. I shall say, Marta, do you want to read out any questions?
Well, more than question at present, I'm sure people are warming up. There are actually a very nice message saying that the talk was great and that people feel as well very positive about the future of psychiatry, which I would say I agree as well. And I want to share, while we wait for people to warm up and write questions, to share something with Professor Sartorius. My experience, and I was thinking about how still it is difficult to get adequate physical care for patients with severe mental illness. In my experience, I have lots of the young patients I work with that at age 25, 26 have such a poor dental hygiene that I've lost a significant proportion of their teeth. And it's practically impossible to get this sorted by the NHS. And of course, this also has an impact on the way they feel confident about going out, interacting with other people, and in turn, a huge impact on the quality of life. And even something as simple as dental care, can be a huge struggle.
Well, we have a minor example of this. A patient or people with lived experience association in Bosnia has in fact had the right to repair teeth but not to replace them. So we found a few $1,000s to give them teeth, artificial teeth and dentures, etc. The consequence of that were enormous. Practically all of them became very much happier people, but about all who were more or less interested in jobs found jobs as well and did something and were more accepted by the families, etc. And I mean, it was a minor investment, but it was an investment into the appearance and in self-confidence and self-esteem.
And it's interesting what you said, that although it was an investment, the impact was so huge that even if we buy the logic of some hospital manager where they only approve money if you can give a cost-effective health economics, you could easily prove how much money at an individual and societal level you can save if you make somebody, again, comfortable and confident to attend job interviews, to speak to the family. So anyway, here, not enough of me. There are questions coming. And
should I read out one comment, Marta? And that's from Alex Leff. Alex,
yes, please.
Alex is professor of cognitive neurology at the Institute of Neurology and UCL. And he says, I have to leave now, I'm afraid, but what a lovely tribute to my dad. I really enjoyed all the talks and hearing all the stories about him. Dad would have loved it. Thanks so much, Alex Leff.
Thank you, Robin, for reading it. So there is a question, well, there is a comment saying that, and I don't know if it is referring to UK, I would assume so, NHS dental waiting list is 3 years. So I think it's actually, when it comes to dental care, it's bad for everybody right now. But also there is a question saying, how can we regain the soul of medicine all over the world?
Well, I think it's easy, the answer. You start with yourself. And I mean, looking a little bit of what one does and how one does it, there are numerous areas of improvement. And I think it's by becoming convinced that that is a useful thing to do, to think about the relationship with the patient as an interhuman interaction, etc. That by itself changes the person. And gradually, I think it's infectious. So I would say as the first step, it would be that. The second step would be perhaps for those who are in charge of training to think about who is a competent teacher, who may teach psychiatry, who may teach psychology, or who may not. Because that also is not only a matter of giving the theory of the importance of being in the right place in the right time, but it's also a mental construct of people who teach and become models later on to deal with patients and with colleagues in a different way.
And there is a question from Anne, who we know very well from Kenya. Nice to see you, Anne, saying great presentation. And how can we motivate students to study psychiatry? And she's saying, I think the stigma in our setting hinders some of our young students from specializing in psychiatry. We currently have 120 psychiatrists in a population of 50 million.
Yes, I think that it is still extremely low, the number of psychiatrists in many of the middle and low income countries. One of the big problems is, of course, that the salaries or earnings of psychiatrists are much lower than, for example, of surgeons or something else. So that's one factor which influences it. And I think the stigma that sits on psychiatry is also, I mean, a young doctor who decides he's going to psychiatry, he will have the first person who will speak to him is his father or mother saying, why do you go to psychiatry? Why don't you go to a real discipline, become a real doctor? I mean, so that the question of stigmatization of stigma is not only true for making the life of patients difficult, it is also influencing students. And I think to a large extent, what I said earlier about who is the teacher in the medical school will to a large extent influence the choice later. People who see a charismatic, really good teacher will try to go into the same direction as he was going. I remember in Nigeria when at the time a very charismatic person, which was Thomas Adeoye Lambo, became the teacher of psychiatry and later the dean of the medical school. All of a sudden there were 60 candidates, which previously never were there, who wanted not only to go into psychiatry, etc., because this was a model which was there. So I think that modeling or being ourselves charismatic and attractive teachers will make others decide to come along. And I think that is one of the very important facets of that. And that also indicates the importance of selecting the right kind of teaching. And also, I think that the therapeutic, somehow, psychiatrists in general are, according to the studies which we have done in the stigma program, they are extremely, the more experienced they are, the more pessimistic they are about psychiatry. And it's not so very surprising. One of them explained it to me. He says, I treat somebody, and if he gets well, he never sees me again and doesn't even greet me in the street. But so I only see those who do not get on well. And this goes on for 40 years. And now I'm only seeing these characters where I failed. And I think I don't like it, but I can't change it. So that in a way, and you can't imagine the word of mouth helping you either. I cannot imagine somebody who's just been successfully treated by Dr. Craig from schizophrenia, going to everybody and saying, you know, Dr. Craig, he's wonderful for teaching schizophrenia, training schizophrenia. I have been myself. They will not do it. They don't speak about their doctors. A good surgeon gets publicity by people saying, my God, if you really want a leg cut off, well, go to Dr. Smith. He is the cutter, number one. I mean, he does it wonderfully. Not with psychiatrists. Most of the word by mouth publicity that psychiatrists should be getting, they don't get. And they have to convince again and again that they are normal and that they are not completely crazy.
And
that one of the curious things about not curious, but surgeons and physicians is that when they know the cause of one of their illnesses, they get on television and they get on the radio and they advocate that you should have a better diet, or you should stop smoking, or you should somehow change your behavior in order to decrease your chances of developing the illness. We as psychiatrists are, maybe we think too individually, but we don't go on to get onto the media and advocate public health measures. I mean, again, thinking about
absolutely.
We work in where some of us work in South London, there are parts of South London and other cities which are psychotogenic. It's surprising you don't become psychotic if you live in some of these places with a loss of community.
But in addition, Robin, we are also giving the wrong message to everybody. We are going out there and saying there are in England 2 million people with mental illness, which means that we are not very competent in treating them, otherwise they wouldn't be there. So it's really, we should be saying in Britain there are 6 million who have been treated without any problems and they are all well. We should give positive messages about ourselves. And I remember, because while I was at WHO, I kept writing this thing. There are 300 million people who are mentally ill. And the answer was always, so you're not doing anything. I mean, can't you do something about them? And I said, yes, give me, no. I mean, so I think it's that our language about our discipline must be showing all these people who are mentally ill and who are now perfectly well. Some of them don't say, like, take the Prime Minister of Norway. He had a depression, had to step down and came back, was re-elected as something. And he became a great protector. And we should, I think, put him in gold and take him around as a talisman wherever we go and make him speak to all of these who don't believe us.
We should certainly take that on board, yes.
And I think I'm going to share with you something that happened recently in where I work as a consultant. We have medical students often coming. And I was asked by my colleague, can you look after these medical students during your clinic? Because I have to leave. And so he came and sat with me for the afternoon. And I apologized and said, I'm sorry, actually, most of the people I'm seeing today are doing very well. And looking back, I thought this is a very silly thing to say. And actually, at the end of the afternoon, he came to me, the medical student, and said, I didn't know that people with psychosis can do so well. I said, you are making me think I would like to become a psychiatrist. And it was nothing to do with me, but it was the reality that, you know, people do get well, but we have this idea that they are not the interesting one, that, you know, when we get medical students, we should sort of just share with them the most difficult and complex cases rather than engaging them in the fact that, you know, we do see people with severe problem that perhaps take longer to improve, but we also see people, I mean, I certainly see lots of them in my clinic that have a first episode of psychosis. They might even be admitted to hospital, but then a year down the line, they're working, they're back in education, they have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and this is something I don't think we're very good at sharing with the new generation. And I think it should become more part of the teaching to talk about the people that get well.
So I think we're coming towards the end, but I would just like to quote one comment, and that is, many thanks for organizing this important webinar. Well-deserved tribute to Julian Leff. WPA acknowledges the efforts and join remembering this legend. And that's from Afzal Javed, who many of you will know is the president of the WPA. And he goes on to say, will the recording be available for general use? I'm thinking to add the recording to WPA educational portal, if the organizers and the presenters would be okay with this request. Of course we would. We would be delighted. But I should say that more parochially, that after a few days we will have the recording up on the website, and it's curiously it's the website of the Maudsley Mediterranean Forum, and the reason why it be there is because we've organized this symposium under the aegis of the Maudsley Mediterranean Forum, because we're used to doing symposia online with it. But also, if you would like, you can come and meet us all in Palermo, where we run a conference every year, or hopefully next year after COVID finishes.
Where is this?
Sorry, Norman?
Yeah, where is this place?
You will know, Professor Sartorius. I'll send you an email about it. It's Palermo.
Okay. Yeah, no, I knew. I
know where Palermo. You know where Palermo
very
is.
Clearly, yes.
And one of the things that the EU study that Craig talked about was that the places that had high incidence of psychosis smoked a lot of cannabis, and the places that had low incidence of cannabis, low incidence of psychosis, such as Palermo, ate large amounts of ice cream. So it may be that ice cream.
It's a new road altogether, a new avenue.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Anyway, we should thank everybody for.
Robin, I wondered if you wanted to mention some of the plans that been discussed about a prize.
Yes, I was going to discuss that. Yes, that several people have raised that in the afternoon, and we've been thinking about it before, that it would be a nice idea to maybe go about raising some funds to have a prize in in honor of Julian, and we need to sort of decide. We've been thinking about this, but we haven't got ourselves organized. We need to decide under whose aegis it should be. But maybe since we should talk with Dr. Javed about the possibility that it could be the WPA. But so we might come back to you saying you've had a nice free webinar, but there is you might like to make a donation to that fund. But that it'll take us a little bit of time to get organized. So I think I've certainly thought it's been a wonderful experience, reminding ourselves of the many talents and attributes of Julian and all the work he did, but also learning of all the new avenues that his work has provoked people into developing. So that's been very interesting too. I don't know, Joan, do you want to say a final word, or
just that I and all the family are very grateful for having had this opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sustaining Julian all these years and enabling him to do his wonderful work. And I think it's it's a great tribute to him that so many people have either participated today or have signed in to try and watch the recording. So thank you very much, and we'll leave you at that point with the relief that nothing technically has gone wrong, which we were always worried about in such times. So thank you all the speakers, and thank you all for participating and sticking with us over quite a long afternoon.
Thank you. Bye to everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.